Hey guys, tonight we're heading into a story that winds across oceans, crashes through rebellions and climbs all the way into the smoky ridges of Appalachia. It's a tale of stubbornness, struggle, and the weirdly specific talent of turning corn into fire. You're about to walk in the worn-out shoes of the Scots-Irish, from their roots in the Scottish lowlands to their long, and honestly pretty painful, journey to the Appalachian Mountains. Spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this, but it's bedtime, so who cares? So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Oh, and drop your city and what time it is in the comments. I love knowing where and when these stories find you. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on stony Scottish ground in the early 1600s, somewhere in the borderlands between Scotland and England. The air tastes like peat smoke and sheep's sweat, and your boots sink into boggy patches with every third step. This is not a peaceful place. It's a long, worn-out stretch of hill country where families feud for generations over stolen cattle and vague insults. The Crown calls you a border reaver, which is a fancy way of saying you and your kin are pretty much armed robbers with family crests. But you didn't ask for the job. You were born into it. Your family's been scraping by on this edge-of-the-world land for so long, it's basically in your bones now. You live off oats, barley, and anything you can trap or lift. The law up here is flexible, depending on who's enforcing it and whether they have a sword. Then King James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England, cue royal identity crisis, and decides this whole lawless frontier thing is a bit of a problem. So he hatches a grand plan: settle your kind in a new territory to stabilise things and keep his more Catholic subjects in check. Enter Ulster. Ulster is the northernmost province of Ireland, and it's wild in a different way. Think rolling green hills, rain that drizzles sideways, and Catholic chieftains who are definitely not excited about a bunch of Scottish Protestants moving in next door. But James has power, and he's tired of your family's brand of chaotic neutral. So when he offers land in Ulster, it's not really an offer. It's a political shoe out the door. You don't own land in Scotland anyway. You rent it, or more accurately, you're allowed to survive on it, so long as you don't complain too loud. The idea of your own farm, even in hostile Irish territory, actually sounds okay. So you pack what little you have, wool clothes, salted meat, and a book of psalms, and you take a ship across the Irish Sea. It's not a long crossing, but it might as well be a galaxy away. You step off the boat in Ulster into a place that feels both familiar and completely foreign. The stone walls remind you of the home, but the accents are different. The tension is thicker. The land is fertile but full of resistance. You're now a planter, part of the plantation of Ulster. Sounds like a nice gardening project, but it's a strategic colonisation campaign. You build your thatch-roofed home while Irish eyes watch from tree lines. At first, the new life is hard but promising. You grow oats, flax and barley. You learn which sheep die quickly and which ones don't. You speak Scots, a rough dialect of English laced with Gaelic growls, but you pick up bits of Irish and manage to trade and survive. Your Presbyterian faith becomes a badge of identity. Clean, stern, and suspicious of ornamentation, compared to the Catholicism that still pulses through the countryside. But tensions don't just simmer here, they boil. The native Irish aren't thrilled with this Scottish influx, and neither are some of the English landlords who start showing up to collect rent like clockwork. There's always someone above you on the food chain. You find yourself in a strange place, a Protestant minority among Protestants, not English enough for the English, and definitely not Irish enough for the Irish. And while you're busy defending your cabbage patch from raiders and your church from regulation, history keeps happening. One day you're raising a barn, the next there's rebellion. In 1641, the Irish rise up in a brutal revolt, and you're right in the path of it. There are massacres, siege warfare, famine, the works. You flee to towns for safety, only to find towns overrun or too weak to help. You learn to move fast, sleep light, and trust only bloodkin, or even then, maybe not. Somehow, your family survives. But what began as a fresh start is now just another generation of grinding, uncertain life. You're tougher than you were in Scotland, but also wearier. You've become a cultural hybrid, still Scottish in name, shaped by Ireland, hardened by decades of mistrust. The term Scots-Irish will come later, a label for this in-between identity. As the 1600s close, your children are farming the same land you bled for, but the taxes rise. The English nobility, mostly absentee, treat Ulster like a cash crop. Rents increase. Tithes are demanded by an Anglican church you don't even belong to. The old promises are wearing thin. You start to hear whispers of a land across the ocean where no lords collect rent, no bishops judge your prayers, and you might actually own what you build. America. It sounds suspiciously optimistic. But at this point, anything sounds better than one more winter on borrowed land with a landlord who's never seen your face. And so the Scots-Irish begin to trickle out. First a few families, then whole villages. They scrape together every coin, sell off livestock, say goodbye to gravestones, and board cramped, disease-ridden ships. The journey is long, the conditions foul, and there's no guarantee of survival. But to you, it's not a risk. It's the only option left. You're not chasing dreams, you're fleeing realities. And the new world is waiting, whether it likes you or not. So now you're in Ulster, clinging to land you don't fully own, with a few cows, some flax, and a garden that only grows anything if the rain remembers not to drown it. But there's still this odd sense of purpose, like you've got your roots halfway in the ground, even if you're always glancing over your shoulder. And then, as if things weren't tense enough, the English crown decides to make it officially miserable by using you and your kin as chess pieces in their ongoing game of Protestant domination. See, the whole point of the Ulster plantation was to create a reliable Protestant buffer between the English rulers and the native Irish Catholic majority. You didn't know you'd signed up to be a human sandbag in a centuries-long religious hurricane, but here you are, you and your fellow settlers, mostly Presbyterian Scots and a few brave English nonconformists, are meant to civilise the region. That's the word they use. Charming, right? In truth, you're plopped down in a hostile environment where every cultural line feels like it's drawn in flint and soaked in gunpowder. The Irish resent your presence with quiet rage, and the English authorities treat you like a maintenance crew they'd rather not pay. You're too rebellious to be trusted, too necessary to be removed. And then there's the religion thing. You're a dyed-in-the-wool Presbyterian, strict, straightforward, suspicious of bishops, bells, or anything that smells too Catholic. You don't like frills in your prayers or gold in your churches. Just you, the scripture, and a very no-nonsense idea of divine justice. Unfortunately, the Anglican Church, the one the English government prefers, is all about hierarchy, authority, and ceremony. To them, your kind is dangerously independent, a little too loud about salvation by scripture alone, and not nearly respectful enough of crowns and clergy. You try to keep to yourselves, build churches, teach the kids to read the Bible, keep the sermons sharp and the morals sharper. But every few years, someone in London decides you need to be reined in. They send bishops to correct your theology, or they just shut down your churches entirely. You're fined for not attending Anglican services, taxed for being religiously wrong, and pressured to give up the very beliefs that helped you survive famine, war, and a literal ocean crossing. Meanwhile, your community is growing, but it's not getting any richer. Most of what you grow goes to pay rent. The landlords, mostly English aristocrats who wouldn't know a spade from a spoon, jack up the rent every few years just to see how much blood they can squeeze from your turnips. And God help you if you complain. Complaining gets you evicted, sometimes burned out. There's a reason your neighbours practice moving house at night, so you adapt. You share tools, trade favours, marry cousins when necessary, hey, options are limited, and lean into that fierce clan loyalty you brought from Scotland. You build communities around churches and kinship, not towns or counties. You drink when there's cause, which is often, and when someone comes for what little you've scraped together, you fight. Not out of rage necessarily, but because at this point survival is a kind of rebellion. Still, you can't help noticing how things feel tighter every year. The good land is taken, the taxes rise, trade is restricted, mostly in ways that hurt small farmers like you. And your children, especially your sons, are starting to ask if this is it. If this is the life you worked so hard not to die in Scotland or starve in Ireland for. They want more. They need more. And that's when you start hearing about America again. You've heard the stories, of course. Ships leaving Londonderry and Belfast with whole families on board, headed for a place where land is cheap, sometimes free, and nobody cares whether your church has bishops. A place where you don't need to bow to a landlord or tithe to a foreign clergy. The letters come back from the colonies filled with wonder and warning. Come quickly, while the land is still open, they say. Bring seed and tools, beware the fever. Don't trust strangers. God is good. It sounds like the usual emigrant mythology, equal parts hope and delusion. But some of your cousins went, and they haven't come back. That says something. And then there's the data no one talks about but everyone sees, the increasing waves of departures. You notice houses left empty, farms untended. The local church has fewer voices in the psalm singing each year. A decision settles in your bones like fog. You start to prepare in secret at first. You sell off what little you can, smuggle coin into seams and sacks, and decide who's going. Not everyone can. Some are too old, some refuse to leave their land, even if it's killing them. But you're ready to gamble, because staying means choking slowly on someone else's power. The journey to the port is just the first trial. Roads are bad, weather worse, and the ship, a creaking, stinking box of wood and desperation. The conditions are brutal. Disease runs rampant. Food is salted to the point of leather. You hold your breath more than you breathe. Some die before even reaching the open sea. Others start to regret it halfway through the Atlantic crossing, when the waves swell higher than the masts and you haven't seen land in weeks. But finally, land appears, dark and forested, humming with insects and opportunity. You land in Pennsylvania, mostly likely in Philadelphia, where they say William Penn wanted it to be a place of tolerance, and maybe it is, sort of. But the English elite don't love your rough manners, and the Germans don't speak your language. Boston turns up its nose, Charleston is too far, and you start to realise something. You didn't cross an ocean to fit in, you came to get out, so you pack up again, this time heading west, or rather southwest, along trails carved by deer and widened by wagons. The Great Wagon Road, they call it. It winds down through the Shenandoah Valley, past tidy farms and into the shadowy curves of the Blue Ridge. It's not easy. You ford rivers, lose wheels, bury children, and eat more cornmeal than seems medically advisable. But you keep going, because there's still land. Rough, forested, unforgiving, but yours. Appalachia isn't much to look at. Not yet. The soil's stingy, the winter's sharp, and the neighbours far too close when they're mad and too far when you need help. But it feels like something you've never had before. Freedom on your own terms. The kind of freedom that asks for your back, your blood, and your silence, but doesn't charge rent. You've gone from lowland raider to Irish planter to colonial refugee, and now you're something new. A settler in the mountains, a Scots-Irish soul in the heart of Appalachia. You're here now. Appalachia. You don't call it that, not yet. It's just the mountains, or the ridge, or maybe over yonder, if you're feeling poetic. But you've arrived. Finally. This is the edge of the world as the colonies know it, and frankly, it's a relief. Nobody's breathing down your neck to tithe or pay rent, and you haven't seen a powdered wig in weeks. Sure, the land is rocky, the weather unpredictable, and the bears more socially available than your nearest neighbour. But it's yours. Yours to fight for, to break your back over, and maybe, just maybe, to pass on. Let's not romanticise it too much, though. The dream of owning land is beautiful until you realise it means clearing that land yourself, one gnarled root and stump at a time. You build a cabin from logs, not plans. No one's handing out instruction manuals or city permits. You dig the clay with your own hands, shape it into a chimney that hopefully won't collapse during your first real winter. Every item you own has a story, and it probably involves barter, blood, or luck. Cattle are your currency now. You know their weight, their diseases, their moods. You don't have money, but you've got 2 good milk cows and a sow about to farrow, and that's better. Trade runs on relationships and handshakes. Your word has to mean something, because once you're up here, there's nobody coming to bail you out if you cheat someone. And while you're adapting to the train is adapting to you. You plant corn because it grows in this rocky soil and keeps better than wheat. You grind it, boil it, fry it, and eventually distill it into something strong enough to light fires and settle arguments. Whiskey's not a luxury, it's practically a coping mechanism. You're not alone in this either. The mountains are starting to fill up with others like you. Scots-Irish families who couldn't hack the flatland politics or just didn't want to. People who speak like you, sing like you, and tell stories that sound suspiciously like your grandfather's tales of ghost dogs and fairy lights back in Ulster. Which brings us to the clans. You didn't leave that part behind. Your family name still means everything. MacDonald, Campbell, Graham, McNeil, each with its own tangled history, rivalries, and allegiances that stretch across the Atlantic. Even if you don't remember the exact feud, you remember not to trust certain surnames. You marry into families close enough to know, but not close enough to raise eyebrows. Family loyalty isn't just tradition, it's protection. The law, as usual, is too far away and too uninterested to help with day-to-day problems. So if someone wrongs you, you don't go to court, you go to your kin. Justice is often homebrewed, and grudges age like whiskey, stronger over time, and the violence? It's there, always. Low level, background static. You're surrounded by forests that still belong, in spirit if not in law, to indigenous peoples who know these trails better than you ever will. The Cherokee, the Shawnee and others don't exactly welcome your sudden appearance with rifles and axes. You've heard stories about attacks, some real, some wildly exaggerated, and you prepare accordingly. You keep a flintlock above the hearth, you teach your children to keep quiet at night, and you plant your fields with a view of the trail so you can see who's coming and decide fast whether they're friend or not. You don't trust outsiders, but you're deeply connected to the ones already here. Communities form around churches and graveyards, small wooden schools and shared mills. The nearest preacher is likely also your cousin, and possibly a blacksmith. And while faith binds you all together, it also stirs things up. You've carried your Presbyterian roots across the sea, but you've had to adapt. There's no centralised authority, no proper synod, so you worship in barns, in fields, in clearings. You sing loud and argue louder, but you show up week after week, because faith is something that outlasts the soil in the winters. Your speech starts to change too. The accents blend, Scots burr, Ulster twang, and whatever new drawl the mountains bake into your tongue. Words get clipped, idioms mutate, and suddenly you-all turns into y'all, and no one's exactly sure how it happened. You make new words for old things, poke for bag, holler for valley. You don't say yes, you say uh-huh, and your kids grow up speaking a dialect that's already baffling outsiders. Language becomes a shield, a code, a cultural marker. And there's music. Oh, there's always music. You brought fiddles over in your sea chests, tucked between wool blankets and family Bibles. You didn't come with luxury, but you came with rhythm. You sing old Scottish ballads, Irish laments, psalm tunes, and drinking songs that somehow all start to blur together in these valleys. The mountains echo back with something new, a sound that hasn't quite found its name yet, but will someday be called old time, then bluegrass, then country. It all starts here, with calloused hands and hoarse voices, under starlit porches and beside smoky hearths. But beneath all of it, the songs, the fields, the fierce independence, is a constant awareness that this life is not for the soft or the slow. You don't get a second chance up here. One bad harvest, one broken leg, one harsh winter, and it's over. So you plan ahead. You keep things simple, sturdy, and close to home. Even your stories are functional. Passed down not just for entertainment, but for survival. Tales about which herbs cure which ailments, which part of the forest to avoid, which neighbours are generous and which aren't. There's also this strange thing that happens after a few years. You stop thinking of yourself as Scots-Irish. Not because you've abandoned the past, but because you've folded into something new. You're mountain folk now. You don't say it out loud, but you feel it when you climb a ridge and see the mist curling through the trees below like a living thing. When the fire crackles in your one-room cabin, and your kids sleep bundled together under quilts sewn from 10 different histories. When your neighbour brings you a smoked ham just because he heard you had a rough week. This is the hard-earned peace you came looking for. Even if it doesn't always feel peaceful, you're still stubborn, still proud, still scrappy. You didn't leave the fights behind. You just brought them higher up the mountain. But now, at least the land fights with you instead of against you. Religion, you find, doesn't stay politely in its Sunday clothes around here. It breaks out of the chapel, kicks off its shoes, and starts shouting in the woods. When you first settle in the Appalachians, faith is quiet and rugged, just like everything else in your life. You gather in little cabins or under rough lean-tos with your neighbours, sitting on split logs while a man with calloused hands and a well-worn Bible tries to make sense of Leviticus without falling asleep. But then something changes. Something loud and strange, and on fire with the kind of energy that makes you wonder if God just learned how to holler. The Presbyterianism you carried across the sea isn't exactly built for this. Back in Ulster, church was formal and structured, full of strong moral codes and soft psalm singing. Here, it's starting to unravel in the best and weirdest way. On the frontier, you need a kind of religion that moves fast, speaks plain, and isn't afraid to get muddy. Enter the frontier preachers. Part holy man, part survivalist, part emotional wrecking ball. They ride circuit on half-starved horses, carrying nothing but a Bible, a flask, and the kind of charisma that can light a fire under even the frostiest backwoods stoic. The Great Awakening hits like a thunderclap. You're not sure what to make of it at first. People who never talked about God are suddenly shouting his name in fields. Men cry in public. Women faint, speak in tongues, confess sins they didn't even know they had. It's emotional, unstructured, and entirely too chaotic for your old Scottish instincts, but it's also magnetic. You can't help but get pulled in when someone you've known your whole life stands up, hands shaking, and talks about seeing the light during a midnight prayer on a creek bank. These outdoor revival meetings, what they'll eventually call camp meetings, become part spiritual experience, part social event, part therapy session. You walk or ride for miles to attend, hauling your kids, a skillet, and maybe a jug of corn whiskey hidden under the wagon seat for medicinal use. There's preaching by day, weeping by night, and singing that goes on until the stars start to fade. No choir robes, no pews, just you, the woods, and a sea of sweaty, sobbing souls who are all trying to outpray each other for a shot at eternal salvation. And yet, there's something beautiful about it. You're in a place where isolation is thick as tree bark, where you might go weeks without seeing someone outside your kin. These revivals are more than church. They're communion in the truest sense. You catch up on births, deaths, gossip, marriages, feuds, and whose barn burned down last month. People trade seeds, stories, and songs. It's part spiritual awakening, part cultural stitching. Because when you're living on the edge of everything, you need every thread you can find. Of course, not everyone agrees on what faith should look like. The Presbyterians think the Baptists are too loose. The Baptists think the Methodists are too structured. The Methodists think everyone else is doing it wrong, but they're too polite to say so out loud. Meanwhile, you've got travelling New Light preachers and old-school Calvinists clashing like dogs over a dropped biscuit. There's no single authority, so religion here is as much a personal declaration as a community practice. You choose your church the way you choose your friends, based on who shows up in the rain and who'll still talk to you after you accidentally shot their mule. Debates about predestination, free will, and adult baptism fill the air alongside smoke from hickory fires. Some folks say God chose you before you were born. Others say he's waiting on you to choose him. Some say you're either saved or damned and there's no changing it, while others preach redemption with the kind of passion usually reserved for courtroom dramas. You don't know who's right, but you do know who's got the best singing and the hottest cornbread at the after-sermon meal. And speaking of music, religion in Appalachia sings. It bleeds into every tune you hum while working, every lullaby you whisper, every dirge at every backwoods funeral. The psalms you once chanted flatly in stone churches back in Ulster are now sung with trembling harmony and a beat that feels like foot stomps in dry leaves. Shape note singing spreads like wildfire, a strange mathematical form of music notation that lets people who can't read music still belt out four-part harmony with the power of 1,000 aching souls. No instruments needed, just lungs, grit, and the will to sing truth louder than doubt. Religion also fills the role that institutions back east tend to hold. There's no courthouse nearby, no school for 100 miles, no doctor you'd trust not to accidentally kill you with a poultice made of possum fat and powdered bark. But your preacher. He'll teach your kids their letters, marry your daughter, deliver your wife's baby, settle a land dispute, and then preach your funeral, all before Sunday supper. Faith isn't just belief here, it's infrastructure. And yet, there's always this push and pull, a tension between the strict, solemn roots of your Scottish Presbyterianism and the wilder, looser spirituality of the frontier. You hear of snake handlers a few ridges over, folks who take Jesus' words a little too literally, others who predict the end of the world every 6 months and are real disappointed every 7th. Then there are the backwoods mystics, those who mix scripture with herb lore, dreams with prophecy. They're not quite witches, but they're not quite not witches either. You avoid eye contact and let them be. There's a debate still lingering. Scholars haven't quite agreed on how much of this emotional, open-air, community-based religion was born purely in Appalachia and how much was carried in and shaped by the land. Was it the terrain that stripped the structure away, or was this flavour of faith always dormant in your people, waiting for a place wild enough to let it out? Either way, you've changed. Religion isn't just about salvation anymore. It's about identity, about surviving the dark winters and the child deaths and the broken tools and the long, bitter silences between visits from someone who remembers your name. You don't pray for comfort. You pray for rain, for strength, for a sow that won't roll over on her litter, and sometimes you pray just to hear your own voice in the stillness. This kind of faith isn't clean, it's not polite, but it holds you together like rough stitching, ugly but strong. You kneel in mud, hands cracked from work, eyes blurry from smoke and tears, and you talk to a God you can't always explain but absolutely believe is listening. And somehow in the shouting and the silence, in the chaos and the candles, you find something you never had before. A sense of home, not just in the land, but in your soul. Let's talk about the one thing that always seems to break a person before anything else does. Money. Or more specifically, lack of it. You're in the mountains now, living on your own land, or at least on land no one's yet come around to evict you from. But the echoes of landlord tyranny haven't exactly faded. The trauma of rising rents and greedy absentee landowners from your Ulster days still clings to your bones like mildew in a damp cabin. So when you hear that land is free here, you clutch it with both hands. But nothing as usual is ever quite that simple. You see, this part of the world, this snaky, forest-choked stretch of Appalachia, isn't exactly charted. There are no clear deeds, few surveys, and even fewer laws that anyone enforces unless someone's already been shot. You claim land by squatting on it, clearing it, and holding it like a dog with a bone. That works for a while, until someone shows up with a piece of paper that says they own it, or a better gun than yours, or a friend in the territorial legislature, and then you're back to fighting, sometimes in court, more often in your yard with powder smoke hanging in the air like morning fog. But rent, the horror of it, returns anyway, just in different clothes. Instead of an Irish landlord in a manor house, it's a land speculator in Richmond or Philadelphia who's never even seen these hills. He bought a chunk of wilderness on parchment and now thinks it's time for you to cough up payment. And you? You were just getting comfortable. You cleared the trees, built the cabin, planted the corn. You watched your children get born and buried under that soil, and now someone says it's not yours? You burn the letter, you load your rifle, and you pray the road stays quiet. Sometimes you cave. You offer payment in the only currency you've got. Corn, hogs, or whiskey. And if they won't take that, well, maybe they'll take nothing at all. That's the tipping point for a lot of mountain folk. When the formal economy breaks down or never bothered to show up in the first place, you build your own. It's part barter, part trust, and part stubborn refusal to use any coin stamped with a king's face or a banker's promise. You trade work for goods. You lend tools and expect them back 3 moons later, plus a favour. You sell extra crops down the ridge in towns that squint at you like you're from another planet. Which, to be fair, you sort of are. But the real gem in this raw economy? That's corn. And not just as food. No, corn becomes your quiet rebellion. Ground into meal for bread, sure, but more importantly, distilled into liquid fire, whiskey. It's your bank account, your bargaining chip, your weekend reward, your grief therapy, and occasionally your downfall. You didn't invent moonshining, but you perfected it. Because why let good corn go to waste when you can turn it into something that keeps forever, warms your insides, and can be traded for just about anything? Your still is hidden naturally. Tucked into a hollow, camouflaged with brush, and rigged with parts that would make an alchemist proud. Copper tubing, barrels, old kettles sealed with flour paste. Making whiskey isn't just a chore, it's an art. You learn to judge mash by smell, to time your cuts with the rise and fall of temperature, to know exactly when the drip turns from poison to profit, and you don't talk about it unless you're very sure who's asking. Because even now, long before Prohibition makes it famous, distilling without a license can land you in trouble, or at least on someone's grudge list. The deeper irony? The same government that sends tax collectors up your path wouldn't even exist without your kind. You fought in the revolution. You bled for a republic that was supposed to be free of landlords and kings and all those high-born parasites who drank tea while you ate boiled roots. And yet, just a few decades after declaring independence, here comes Uncle Sam with his hand out, demanding a whiskey tax. You can't help but laugh, bitterly. It's this moment, among others, that births the famous Scots-Irish temper. Not fiery in a cartoonish way, but cold and sharp and patient. The kind of temper that waits until the sun goes down, loads the rifle, and sets off through the woods to have a talk. You're not violent for fun. You're violent because that's often the only language people in power understand. And when someone tries to take what little you've clawed together, you don't write letters, you send messages. Of course, this reputation starts to precede you. By the early 1800s, the term Scots-Irish is becoming shorthand for poor, proud, and not to be messed with. Flatlanders complain about your accent, your suspicion of authority, your preference for feuding over court cases. They call you rough, backwards, even dangerous. But they also admire your toughness, your loyalty, your eerie talent for surviving whatever the world throws at you. You don't deny the temper, but it's more than anger. It's armour. It's centuries of being pushed off land, overtaxed, lied to and hunted. It's Ulster and the borderlands and Appalachia all twisted into the same tightly wound coil. You don't want a fight, but if one comes, you'll make sure your side is remembered. Scholars still argue about how much of this cultural temperament is inherited from your ancestors' tribal past, and how much is simply a response to poverty, isolation, and exploitation. Is it genetics? Environment? Trauma passed down through cradle songs and campfire warnings? Maybe it's all of it. Maybe it doesn't matter. You don't need an academic to tell you why your blood runs hot and your memory runs long. You just know it does. And so, you get by. You raise children, who raise more children. You pass down stories, recipes, curses, and hymns. You teach them not just how to till soil or split logs, but how to read a man's intentions, how to hold their silence when it counts, and how to spit out a lie when a taxman comes asking what's bubbling in the woods. You haven't escaped hardship, but you've built a world where you decide which hardships to endure, and that in this twisted corner of the world counts as freedom. You're heading west again, not because you want to, but because it's either move or get swallowed by what's coming behind you. Crowds, laws, tax collectors, civilization they call it. You call it trouble. The farther the cities push into the valleys and foothills, the deeper you head into the folds of the mountains. You follow buffalo paths, turn to foot trails, turn to wagon ruts, and somewhere along the way, you begin to feel the map disappearing beneath your feet, which is exactly how you like it. You've never been comfortable in places with too many rules, too many people, or too many opinions about how you should live. Cities feel like cages. Lowlands feel like someone else's land, even if it's yours on paper. But the mountains, Appalachia, is big enough to hold all your contradictions. It lets you be alone without being completely cut off, lets you live poor without feeling ashamed, and lets you be suspicious of outsiders without having to explain yourself. And so you go deeper. Maybe you're just looking for a little more space between you and the reach of authority. Maybe your brother-in-law got into a feud that ended with someone face down in a creek. Or maybe it's just habit now, this generational instinct to pick up and push forward when things get too loud. Whatever the reason, you're loading up your wagon with cracked barrels, a Bible, a sack of cornmeal, and every iron tool you can carry. You kiss the old home place goodbye, again, and disappear into the trees. The trek is miserable, of course. It always is. The trails are steep, washed out, and half choked with brush. The axle breaks. The mule gets sick. Your kids cry because they miss the neighbours they swore they hated. But eventually you round a bend and find a flat stretch of land near a creek, and something in your bones says, "This is it." You plant your boot in the soil, look up at the ridge that blocks the sunrise till almost noon, and decide this is where your people will dig in. And once again, you start over. You build a cabin, probably a little sturdier than the last one. You stack stones for a chimney, plant beans and squash in the gaps between the stumps. You carve out a life inch by inch, with no guarantee it'll last. The nearest town is a day's ride, and the only reason you go is to buy salt or see the blacksmith about fixing the same busted plough blade for the 5th time. Your neighbours are few, but they're like you, Scots-Irish, tough as dried jerky, and not all that eager to chat unless it's about weather, hunting, or who shot whose hog last winter. You learn quickly who you can count on and who to avoid, and for the most part you leave each other alone. That's part of the unspoken code. You don't ask questions you don't want answers to, and you don't show up uninvited unless someone's house is on fire. Even then, you knock first. The land is more than just property now. It's memory. It holds your children's laughter, your mother's grave, your grandpa's still. Every tree you cut, every rock you move, roots you deeper into this place. You're no longer just a settler, you're a keeper of something. Not because anyone told you to be, but because it feels like the only thing you can be. There's honour in staying put once you've finally found somewhere that doesn't spit you out. Still, you're not alone in your journey. You're part of a much larger wave of Scots-Irish families making the same move, all drawn westward by stories of unclaimed land and independence. They pour through the Cumberland Gap, trickle down from the Shenandoah, settle into the hollows of what will become Tennessee, Kentucky, the Carolinas, Georgia. They bring their axes, their fiddles, their Bibles and their grudges. By the late 1700s, the interior South is thick with names that sound like yours: McCoy, Campbell, Buchanan, Wallace. But here's the problem. You're not the first people here. The mountains have already been claimed, walked, loved, and fought over by native peoples for generations, long before you ever figured out how to spell Appalachia. The Cherokee in the southern stretches, the Shawnee and Mingo farther north. They know these forests better than you ever will, and now you're building your cabins on their hunting trails, fishing in their creeks, cutting down their sacred trees. You don't see them often, not at first. They move like ghosts, silent and swift, keeping their distance. But the tension hangs over everything, like a thunderhead that never quite rolls in. Every stick that snaps in the woods makes your pulse jump. Every dog bark at night makes you reach for the rifle. You want peace, but you also want the land. And those two things, it turns out, rarely get to live in the same house. Some scholars argue that the Scots-Irish were natural allies of the frontier, that their hardened history made them sympathetic to indigenous resistance. Others say you were just another settler group, wrapped in the same self-righteous belief that your God wanted you to have this land. The truth is probably somewhere in the smoke. Like most things, you weren't monsters, but you weren't saints either. You were just people, desperate, tough, and tired of being pushed around. And the government? Oh, they're more than happy to let you do the dirty work. They want those Western territories settled, but they don't want to pay armies to do it. So they let you go first. Hardy, half-wild, semi-expendable. You tame the wilderness with your blood and axes, and once it's safe enough for proper roads and real towns, they show up with surveys and taxes. Classic. But still, you endure. Because endurance is what you do. The land might be steep, but your will is steeper. You teach your kids how to track deer, skin rabbits, patch roofs with moss and mud. You show them how to plant crops in narrow terraces and how to string up a snare that could feed a family. And maybe most importantly, you teach them never to trust someone who talks too smooth and wears shoes that look too clean. Your culture deepens, hardens, sharpens. You no longer think of yourself as an immigrant. You're not Scottish anymore, not really Irish either. You're something new, a mountain person, a creature of hollows and ridges, of low expectations and high resilience. You don't ask for much, just land you can work, food on the table, and enough peace to keep your family out of someone else's feud. By now the East has forgotten you, and you're fine with that. You came here to be forgotten. You came here to disappear, and in doing so, you became something unforgettable. Let's get something straight right now. When you finally land in America and set foot in the so-called New World, it's not exactly rolling out a tartan welcome mat for the likes of you. You arrive poor, rough, and already a little suspicious of anybody who isn't family. The big coastal cities, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, they give you that look. You know the one. Like you tracked in mud from a place they've only ever heard about in old sermons and bad jokes. You're Scots-Irish, which to them might as well mean penniless trouble with an accent. Philadelphia, bless it, tolerates you. Barely. You're not Anglican, so the English elite eye you sideways. You're not German or Quaker, so there's no built-in community to absorb you. You show up in your coarse wool clothes, speaking fast and clipped, hauling kids and Bibles and a lot of emotional baggage about landlords. The city folk think you're uncultured, loud, and possibly dangerous. They're not entirely wrong, but also not entirely right. You just don't blend. You never blend. Boston? Forget it. That's a city that likes its tea hot, its morals cold, and its neighbours predictable. You're none of those things. Your brand of religion is too emotional, your sense of humour too dark, and your politics. Well, what politics? You don't have time for that nonsense. You're trying to feed your family, not argue over taxes on molasses. So Boston shuts you out before you even knock. It smells the Ulster smoke on you and says no thanks. So you move on, southward, westward, away from the ports and past the ploughed fields. You follow rumours, trails, old animal paths that have slowly been worn into roads by wagon wheels and bare feet. You follow the Great Wagon Road, the dirt artery that runs down from Pennsylvania into the Shenandoah Valley, and keeps curling through the hills like it's trying to avoid being pinned down. And honestly, it's the perfect road for people like you, slippery, unpredictable, and headed toward land nobody else seems to want. You're not the only one on this path. There are others like you, wave after wave of Scots-Irish families who've had enough of cities that treat them like disease vectors. They're rough too, loud, independent. They've got the same frontier glint in their eyes and the same willingness to camp under their wagon if it means getting 1 mile closer to owning a patch of land. You start recognising surnames. Some are cousins. Some are people you don't speak to anymore because of that whole pig dispute 2 counties back. Doesn't matter. You're all moving in the same direction. The road is brutal, muddy when it rains, dusty when it doesn't. It snakes through forests where wolves still howl at night, and every now and then you pass a burned-out wagon that makes you wonder who didn't make it. But it's also freedom. Every mile you put between yourself and those smug cities is a mile closer to a life where no one taxes your grain or asks if your faith has a bishop's approval. You start to hear about the land, down in the valleys, nestled between jagged ridges that seem to scrape the clouds. Land that's rocky and wild and not worth the trouble to most English planters. They want wide, flat fields for tobacco and slaves. But you'll take the hard land, the steep hollows, the woods that breathe mist in the mornings and hide game trails older than any map. It's land nobody wants, so it's perfect for you. When you finally get there, your first thought might be, this is it. The soil is stingy, more stone than earth. The trees are ancient and indifferent. You can't see more than 20 feet without running into a boulder, a thicket, or a bear. But you also don't see lords, or taxmen, or that familiar boot heel of someone richer and more educated telling you what to do. And that silence, that's the sound of possibility. So you stay. You set up a cabin near a spring. You burn brush for 3 days just to make space for a garden the size of a doormat. You learn to plant corn on the slope and not cry when half of it gets eaten by deer. You keep your rifle loaded not just for hunting, but because you've learned, through generations of betrayal, that peace never lasts. The townfolk think you're primitive. They don't get it. They look at your rough clothes and thick accent and assume you couldn't make it in their world. But what they don't realise is, you chose this. You chose the edge, the isolation, the back-breaking work. Because this is the first time in your whole cursed lineage that no one is breathing down your neck for rent or tithes or tribute. You are at last left alone. Mostly. The truth is, even out here you're never completely free of outsiders. Every so often someone comes riding up your trail, usually a preacher, a tax collector, or a relative you were hoping died at sea. And when they come, they bring questions. Sometimes those questions are about your land claim, sometimes about your crops, sometimes about your whiskey, which you definitely don't make, definitely don't sell, and definitely don't store under the floorboards in the barn, no sir. But the deeper you go into the hills, the fewer questions get asked. You start to realise that the land doesn't care where you came from. It doesn't care about your accent, your faith, your rage. It only cares whether you can outlast it. And you can. You will. Because your people have been outlasting impossible things for centuries. There's debate among scholars, of course, about how much you were pushed versus how much you were pulled into Appalachia. Some say it was economic necessity. Others say it was cultural. Your fierce independence made the frontier the only place you could really thrive. Still others argue it was the only path left to a people too stubborn to change and too proud to beg. Maybe it's all of those. Or maybe it's just that you saw the mountain and said, yeah, I can take that. And now that you're here, the land becomes part of you. It shapes your habits, your speech, your faith. It teaches you which roots heal and which mushrooms kill. It gives you a soundtrack of cicadas and whip-poor wills and creeks that hum like lullabies under the moonlight. You stop looking back. There's no Ulster anymore, no lowlands, no King's Road, just ridge and sky and whatever you can carry in your heart, and you carry a lot. The trail that brought you here, rough, winding, packed with wagons, footsteps, and stubborn hope, has a name now. Folks start calling it the Great Wagon Road, though most days it feels like the Great Wagon Rut, the way your wheels get stuck in it. But for the Scots-Irish, it's more than just a way south. It's a lifeline, a freedom funnel that pours your people out of the crowded mid-Atlantic cities and into the belly of the Blue Ridge. If you keep following it, you'll pass through the Shenandoah Valley, where the soil's decent and the views are better, then down through the Carolina Piedmont, and, if your luck holds, even deeper into mountain country where the ridges start stacking like dominoes and the air smells like pine and independence. The road isn't paved, of course, not unless you count the scattered stones, broken wheels and dead dreams littered along its path. It's a mix of ancient animal trails, native trade routes, and whatever half-cleared track the last wagon made before yours. Sometimes it disappears entirely, swallowed by river crossings or thick forest. You keep going anyway, trusting your gut, your mule, or that one cousin who swears he's been this way before. He hasn't. And you're not alone. All around you are others making the same gamble. The road becomes a community of its own, temporary, gruff, mostly tired. There are Germans with iron pots and songs you don't understand. Free black families moving with quiet urgency. English dissenters who quote scripture like it's punctuation. But most of the people trudging this trail with you are just like you. Scots-Irish, scraped raw by empire, chasing land and a little bit of peace. You start to notice patterns. The way your people settle in swells, first into Pennsylvania, then Virginia, and then south, always south, curling along the spine of the mountains like smoke. You rarely stay in one place long unless the land gives back. If it doesn't, you move. And if it does, you hold on like a snapping turtle on a boot sole. The Great Wagon Road isn't just a migration route. It's an artery of culture, bleeding Ulster into Appalachia with every footstep. You carry your language, fast, clipped, spiked with vowels that confuse even the English. You carry your stories, full of ghosts, second sight, and deals struck at crossroads. You carry your faith, your feuds, your songs, and your recipes. And slowly the road becomes lined not with milestones, but with memory. Eventually you find a place to stop. Maybe it's the valley below a ridge, or the stretch beside a creek with trout fat enough to fill a skillet. You park the wagon, unload the tools, and start building, not just a cabin, but a life. You meet neighbours who showed up the week before and already have an opinion about your fence line. You plant corn, chase off deer, hang a kettle in the hearth, and listen for panthers at night. Civilization, in your world, begins when you light the second fire, and then, like always, others follow. The road doesn't end just because you stopped. It keeps flowing behind you, pouring in cousins, friends of cousins, and that one uncle everyone hoped stayed in Ireland. Soon, your hollow has a church, then a school, then a general store run by a man who talks too smooth to be fully trusted. And just like that, what was wilderness becomes a settlement, a town, a rumour with a name and a place on a map, even if the map is wrong. Still, this kind of life demands a flexibility most folks don't understand. You have to be ready to farm, fight, build, and bury, all within a single season. You grow your own food, sew your own clothes, and if you don't know how to fix a wheel axle, you learn fast or you don't get far. You teach your kids everything you know, plus a few tricks you learned from watching the neighbour who's missing 3 fingers, but somehow still chops wood better than anyone else. And even in the wildest stretches of the road, there's a kind of rhythm to life. You rise with the sun, feed the animals, check the traps, hoe the corn, and fall asleep with the bones of your day already aching. Every now and then someone from town comes through and brings news from far-off places. You nod politely and pretend to care, but deep down you already know the important things. Whether the rains are coming, whether your neighbour's cow calved, and whether the preacher's daughter ran off with that fiddler after the last revival meeting. Here's the thing though, the deeper you go into the hills, the more the outside world starts to forget about you. And frankly, you prefer it that way. Let them laugh at your accent and write pamphlets calling you white savages. Let them debate your IQ in coffee houses while you're out here splitting rails and trying to keep raccoons out of your corn. You didn't come here to be part of their world. You came here to build your own, but you're not immune to the slow creep of change. Roads improve, towns grow, and eventually people start talking about forming counties, holding elections, raising militias. You nod and smile, but you keep your powder dry in your ear to the wind. Because every time authority promises help, it tends to come with a bill. You've seen this story before, in Scotland, in Ulster, in Pennsylvania. You know how it ends. Still, the wagon road continues on. By the early 1800s, it stretches like a long spine down into Georgia, Tennessee, and beyond. People keep moving along it, pulled by the promise of land and pushed by the chokehold of the coast. Some leave because they have to. Others leave because they just can't sit still. But you leave because the mountain keeps calling, and because every time you hear about another ridge, another stream, another untouched valley, it feels like a dare. Some scholars argue that the Scots-Irish were less a community and more a process. That's a fancy way of saying your people were always moving, always reshaping themselves, like a river carving through rock. You weren't meant to settle, you were meant to flow. But here, finally the river slows. The hollows grow familiar. The road behind you fades into legend, and the road ahead, well, it can wait. You hang your hat, take a long look at the fire you built, and for the first time in maybe a century you think, maybe I'll stay a while. There's a funny thing about the land you finally settled. It's the kind no one else wanted. Flatlanders looked at these mountains and said, too steep. The planters said, not enough soil. The speculators said, can't build a proper road through that mess. But you looked at these ridges rising like the spines of sleeping giants, heard the wind slipping through the gaps like a whisper in your own language and said, this'll do. You're in Appalachia now. Real Appalachia. The spine of the continent twisted and ancient, older than the Rockies, carved by time and water and endless patience. There's no straight line here, not in the roads, not in the rivers, not in the people. Everything bends, curves, settles in its own rhythm. You get used to walking uphill both ways, and you get used to being ignored by the rest of the world, until they want something, of course. The land isn't generous, but it's honest. What you get from it, you earn. You dig with a mattock until your back stiffens and your hands split. You coax beans and squash from soil that's more rock than dirt. You plant corn because it grows tall even when hope doesn't. You build your cabin from the trees you cut, and every log in the wall reminds you of the blisters it cost. You sleep beside your rifle, not for romance, but because out here safety is a personal responsibility. There's game if you know where to look. Deer, turkey, squirrel, lean protein on 4 legs. You set traps, walk trails, and teach your sons the difference between tracks and shadows. The forest is food, fuel, and sometimes threat. You respect it because it could kill you without blinking. You also love it, even if you'd never admit it out loud. And there's water, thank God. Springs that burst from mossy stones like miracles. Creeks that run clear and cold enough to numb your bones, if not cleanse your sins. You build your cabin near one, and its gurgle becomes background music to your life. You haul buckets morning and night, you fish in it, you bathe when the weather allows, and when it doesn't, well, nobody smells like roses out here anyway. The air, it's clean, sharp, wild. It smells like pine, smoke, and damp earth. The kind of air that clears your head and cuts through whatever fog your thoughts were hiding behind. You breathe deep, and don't even realise how badly you needed it until your lungs stretch out like they've been asleep. And the views, well, those are your riches. You stand at the top of a ridge at dawn, watching light spill like melted gold over the treetops, and for a moment, just a moment, you feel rich. Not in coin, not in title, but in something deeper. Like you've finally laid claim to a piece of the world that can't be taxed, stolen, or paved. But don't mistake all this for paradise. The land may be honest, but it's not forgiving. Your crops fail more than they thrive. Your livestock wander off, get taken by bobcats or disease. A hard frost in May can ruin your whole year. And when winter comes, it doesn't ask if you're ready. It just drops, like a stone, and dares you to survive. You patch your roof with bark and whatever cloth you can spare. You stockpile wood and salt pork and hope your child's cough doesn't turn into something that needs a doctor, because the closest one is 3 ridges over, and might not know any more than your granny anyway. The isolation is both blessing and curse. You can go weeks without seeing a stranger, which is peaceful, until something goes wrong. A broken leg, a sick child, a barn fire, and suddenly that long stretch of silence feels like a noose. But then someone shows up. A neighbour with a mule and a sack of cornmeal. A cousin who heard you were in trouble and came with extra hands and a jug of tonic. No one says much. They just get to work. Because out here, survival isn't about individualism. It's about interdependence without interference. You learn the mountain ways fast. Don't plant until the dogwood blooms. Don't trust a clear sky in March. Don't cross certain hollers unless you want to meet someone who doesn't take kindly to visitors. You learn the folk knowledge passed down from Ulster and twisted through time. How to use pokeweed as medicine if you prepare it right. How to cure meat with hickory smoke and luck. How to keep snakes out of the cabin with mothballs and moonshine fumes. You don't ask where the knowledge came from, you just trust it. And slowly your family becomes part of the landscape. Your accent sharpens, your speech slows, your humour gets darker and funnier in the same breath. You don't say hello, you nod. You don't ask for help. You show up with an extra shovel and start digging. Your kids grow up half wild, barefoot, smart in ways no school can teach. They learn to skin a rabbit before they learn long division. They know how to track a possum and how to listen when the woods go quiet, because that's when the big things are near. To the outside world, you're invisible, or worse, ridiculed. They call you hillbillies, backwards, ignorant. They say your people are stuck in the past. But here's the thing they don't understand. You're not stuck. You chose this past. You carry it like a torch, not a burden. You remember where you came from, Scotland, Ireland, Ulster, the wagon roads, and every piece of that history is stitched into the way you live now. Some folks argue that Appalachia was settled because it was available, that the Scots-Irish were just too poor to afford the good land. Maybe that's true, but it's not the full truth. The full truth is, you made this hard land yours because it spoke to something in your bones, a need for space, for silence, for freedom, that wasn't polite or polished, but real. And so, when the storms roll in and the creek rises, when the harvest comes up short and your boots wear thin, you don't pack up and leave. You just square your shoulders, pull your coat tighter and say, well, it ain't supposed to be easy. By now, you've carved out more than just a home. You've built a whole way of life. The cabin's logs are silvered with rain and years, the smokehouse stands sturdy on its tilted legs, and the corn patch might not feed an army, but it'll keep your family alive through winter if the raccoons don't get too ambitious. You've got chickens that refuse to lay where you can find the eggs, a cow with the attitude of a mule, and a mule with the attitude of a preacher who just caught you skipping church. It's not glamorous, but it's yours, and it runs on one thing more than anything else: loyalty. Family comes first, always. That's not just a saying, it's a survival mechanism. You trust your kin before anyone else, because when the weather turns or trouble comes creeping up your holler, blood's who shows up. Your kids work the land beside you. Your wife patches shirts by firelight while humming tunes she barely remembers learning. Your neighbours might be kin too, cousins, in-laws, and people who married someone's second aunt twice removed. Everyone's related somehow, which makes feuds especially interesting and family gatherings borderline dangerous. You eat what you grow or what you can trade for. Corn is king. It's your bread, your breakfast, your livestock feed, and when times are extra lean, your coin. And yes, sometimes your coping mechanism. You don't waste a kernel. Cornbread, mush, grits, hoe cakes. You've got recipes for every mood, and when you've got a little extra, you distill it. That's right. You build yourself a little still tucked back in the woods, where the smoke disappears into the trees and the revenuers can't sniff you out. Whiskey isn't just a drink, it's a bond, a barter item, a medicine if you ask the right person. You pour it at weddings, sip it at funerals, trade it for bullets, salt or stories. You're not trying to break laws, you're just ignoring the ones that don't make sense in a place like this. And nobody sees anything, because everyone's either doing it too or benefiting from it. It's like a secret handshake made of fire and corn mash. And while you're building your small kingdom of log walls and smoky secrets, you're also living by a code that's older than these hills, one that travelled with you from Scotland to Ulster to America. Loyalty, yes, but also pride, grit, and a sharp sense of justice that doesn't come from law books. If someone wrongs you, you remember. If someone helps you, you remember that too, maybe even longer. Feuds aren't born overnight. They usually start with something small. A pig crosses a fence. A cow is claimed by two families. Someone gets too friendly with someone else's daughter. But once a line's crossed, it's drawn deep. You don't run to the sheriff. You settle things yourself, or your brothers do, or your uncles, or that one cousin who doesn't talk much but always seems to be carrying a knife just in case. This isn't lawlessness. It's just law that runs on memory and reputation. If your name's good, doors open. If it's not, you better keep one eye open at night and maybe skip the next church supper. You teach your kids that a handshake matters, that your word is your signature and your actions write your legacy. Not because you're noble, but because trust is the only currency more valuable than corn. And speaking of church, you still go. Maybe not every Sunday, and maybe the preacher's more boot-wearing than Bible-thumping, but it's part of your rhythm. Services are simple, hard benches, louder than needed hymns, sermons that veer off into stories about mules, storms, and that one verse in Leviticus that seems to apply to everyone's sins, conveniently. But you go because it connects you, not just to God, but to your people. to shared meals after service, to whispered gossip under wide-brimmed hats, to hymns sung off-key but from the heart. Your faith, like everything else out here, is homemade. It doesn't rely on stained glass or steeples. It lives in quilted blankets and dinner tables and whispered prayers over sick children. It's practical, not showy. God's not someone you fear so much as someone you talk to when the creek rises or the beans won't sprout. And if he doesn't answer, well, you've got grit and a good hoe. That'll get you through most days. Education's another thing you make do with. If you're lucky, there's a one-room schoolhouse within walking distance, by which you mean a half-day's walk for a kid with strong legs and questionable shoes. The teacher's probably just a little older than the students and makes less than a barrel of corn whiskey a year, but she tries. You send your children with slates and tin lunch pails and hope they come back, knowing enough to read the Bible and maybe write their own name without swapping the letters around. And music. Don't forget the music. Evenings, after the work is done and the air gets soft, you pull out the fiddle, or your boy does. Someone else thumps a banjo, and maybe Granny hums a harmony that sounds like a memory from before the Revolution. The music is old, bent through time, carried in the bones. Ballads from Scotland, laments from Ireland, a few psalm tunes twisted into mountain hymns, songs of murder, loss, longing, and the occasional absurdity involving a drunken rooster or a lovesick possum. This is how culture survives. Not in libraries, but in kitchens. Not on stages, but on porches. You sing not to entertain, but to remember, to pass it down, to remind your children that they're part of something older, something that didn't begin in this hollow and won't end with their bones buried in the family plot out back. There's no state line for the world you're building. No mayor, no clean borders. It's all ridges and rivers, memory and blood, corn and loyalty. It's fierce. It's flawed. It's sometimes too much to bear. But it's yours. And it doesn't ask you to be perfect. Just to endure. Enemies come with the territory. You don't look for them, but you don't have to. They find their way up the holler eventually, riding horses, carrying ledgers, waving flags, or wearing expressions that say they know what's best for you. Out here in the mountains, surrounded by people just as hard-headed as you are, conflict is less a possibility and more a constant feature of the terrain. It's like the weather, unpredictable, often violent, and always easier to handle if you've got a good roof and a loaded musket. The first threat, naturally, is the one that's been there from the start. Indigenous nations who, for very understandable reasons, aren't thrilled about you planting corn on their ancestral land. The Cherokee, Shawnee and other peoples didn't go anywhere just because you built a cabin. They were here before the first boot print from Ulster ever hit the soil. You pushed deeper into the mountains to escape the reach of colonial governments, but in doing so, you stepped right into someone else's territory. And while some encounters are peaceful, trading furs, swapping stories, learning a few tricks about surviving winter, others are not. There are raids, ambushes, warnings carved into trees or whispered through town about a war party seen near the ridge. You keep your rifle loaded and your children close. You pray no one makes a mistake that turns a bad night into a blood feud. Sometimes you fight because you have to, other times because you were told to, but often, if you're honest, because you don't know how else to live anymore. Then come the tax collectors, not the ones you ignore with a wave and a bottle of shine. No, these are the ones backed by law, marching up the wagon trails with documents, badges, and an infuriating sense of entitlement. They're collecting taxes on your land, your crops, and most insultingly, your whiskey. You try to keep your distilling quiet, but somehow word gets out. Maybe a neighbour you thought you could trust needed a favour from the sheriff. Maybe someone talked after too much sampling, and now they want to register your still, regulate it, tax it. You laugh at first. Surely they're joking. You didn't cross an ocean, fight off redcoats, and drag a plough through this rock-studded soil, just to hand over your livelihood to some pencil neck in a waistcoat who thinks corn comes from a store. But they're not joking. And suddenly, what was once a quiet, backwards business becomes a symbol of defiance. You're not alone in your fury. All across the mountains, other distillers are lighting their fires at night and talking in code. The Whiskey Rebellion, they'll call it later. A name that sounds grand enough to be remembered in textbooks, though for you, it's just one more round in the fight against being told what to do by people who've never grown a single crop in their lives. You know how to handle this kind of pressure. You melt into the trees, you hide your stills deeper, you stop talking to strangers and start checking the woods for signs of recent passage. And while taxmen are bad, nothing quite gets under your skin like the Flatlanders. These are the civilized folk from the lowlands, the towns and cities, the ones who look at your calloused hands and accent like they're studying a strange animal. They come up here occasionally, land buyers, missionaries, politicians, or the dreaded surveyor. You can spot them by their clean boots and the way they keep glancing over their shoulders, like the trees might reach out and grab them. They ask questions with too many syllables and listen with that polite, condescending silence that says they've already decided what you are before you open your mouth. To them, you're a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. You speak in a rhythm they don't understand. You keep your distance from institutions they revere. You solve problems with your fists or your rifle, before you ever think about lawyers. You live without much money, but with more pride than they think makes sense, and that makes them nervous, because people who don't need them can't be controlled by them. So the rumours begin. Tales about your temper, your drinking, your inbreeding, your backward ways. They turn you into caricatures, hillbillies, moonshiners, barefoot bumpkins living in cabins with dirt floors and 12 kids named after livestock. They laugh at you in newspapers. They portray you in plays. They write songs that turn your pain into a punchline. And you hear it, even if they think you don't. You hear it when you go down to town for salt or flour. You feel it in the way they look at your daughter when she walks in with bare feet and a homespun dress. You see it in the way the judge always sides with the man who uses the word therefore in conversation. But you don't argue. You just dig deeper. Not into the land, into yourselves. You raise your children to recognize the look in a stranger's eyes that says they think less of you. You teach them that the world outside these ridges won't understand who they are, and that's fine. Understanding isn't necessary, survival is. You tell them stories of your ancestors who came over in rickety ships, who bled in Ireland, who fought off soldiers and sheriffs alike. You don't need approval, you need legacy. That pride, that unwillingness to bend to outside judgment, is both your shield and your burden. It keeps your community close-knit, loyal, almost impenetrable. But it also makes it hard to change, hard to forgive, hard to admit when someone inside the clan might be the one causing harm. You carry your grudges like heirlooms. You pass down both strength and stubbornness in equal measure. Scholars still debate whether the Scots-Irish were inherently rebellious, or simply made that way by centuries of being mistreated. Chicken or egg, temper or trauma. You don't care much for the debate. What you know is that when someone tries to take what's yours, your land, your crops, your dignity, you don't write letters. You pick up your rifle, stand on your porch and make it clear. They're welcome to try. Enemies will always come, some with guns, some with contracts, some with kind voices hiding cruel plans. But you've learned that the best defense isn't just firepower, it's memory, and you remember everything. So let's talk about that whiskey. Again, not because you're obsessed, but because it keeps coming up, doesn't it? See, out here in the mountains, whiskey isn't just something you sip, it's something you are. It's currency, it's medicine, it's a quiet protest in a bottle. And when the government tries to tax it, again, you don't just get mad, you turn it into a rebellion. We're in the 1790s now. The revolution's over, the British have been kicked out, and a bunch of powdered Whig types in Philadelphia are figuring out how to pay for this shiny new country. They look around, scratching their heads, trying to think of something reliable they can squeeze for revenue, and someone at the table says, "What about whiskey?" And they all nod, because none of them have ever had to build a still with their own hands or dodge revenuers through thickets of laurel. Makes perfect sense to them. To you, it's a slap in the face. You didn't come all the way to America, hack your way through forest, dodge wolves and frost and starvation, just so some guy named Alexander Hamilton could stick his hand in your mash bucket. You already paid in blood during the Revolution. You fought, or your father did, or your uncle who lost an eye at the Battle of Kings Mountain. And now the same government you helped build is sending tax collectors up your trail like it's business as usual. Not on your watch. You're not alone. Across western Pennsylvania, western Virginia, and deep into the Blue Ridge and Allegheny Ranges, other Scots-Irish distillers are coming to the same boiling point. Whiskey is their livelihood too. You can't haul bushels of grain over mountain roads without losing half of it to rot or raccoons. But you can distill it into something shelf-stable, compact, and, let's be honest, way more fun at family gatherings. The still is your bank, your insurance, your reward after a brutal harvest, and suddenly it's illegal unless you pay for a permit you can't afford, file paperwork you can't read, and haul your product over dangerous terrain to a registered site where someone in a coat and tie will weigh it and judge it. So you rebel. At first it's small things, refusals, mutters, A few tax agents are turned away politely, others not so politely. Their ledgers get tossed in creeks, their wagons disappear in the night, then it escalates. One tax collector gets tarred and feathered, an old favourite from the Revolution. Another's house is burned, a few go missing entirely. You don't know the full details, but the woods have a way of hiding things, and suddenly, the Whiskey Rebellion is more than just a series of local dust-ups. It's a full-blown challenge to federal authority. George Washington himself rides out at the head of a militia to put it down, which is rich considering he probably drank a fair bit of untaxed whiskey himself. But even he knows, this isn't just about booze, it's about power. Who gets to make the rules, and who gets to say, not here, not in these hills? You watch it all unfold with that familiar Scots-Irish expression, equal parts defiance and exhaustion. You've seen this before, back in Ulster, back in Scotland. The face of power never changes, no matter how democratic it claims to be. It's always someone in a fancier coat telling you that your way of surviving is a problem. That what you've built with your hands and your sweat and your silence is suddenly illegal. And yet the mountains protect you. They always do. The rebellion fizzles out in the lowlands, but up here, the stills keep bubbling. You just hide them deeper, cover the trails with brush, set traps for anyone too curious. You don't talk about it openly, but you know who's running shine. You can smell it on their clothes, see it in the satisfaction of someone who just traded a jug for a pig and a length of rope. The government pretends to win, of course. They publish newspapers that say the rebellion has ended, order has been restored, taxes are being paid. But everyone in Appalachia knows better. You're not paying a cent. Not because you're lawless, but because their laws don't apply up here unless you decide they do. The ridge is your courtroom. The pines are your jury. The only justice you respect is the kind that shows up with a firm handshake or a loaded musket, depending on the mood. You pass the knowledge down. Not just how to make whiskey, but how to protect it. Your kids learn the right time to harvest corn for mash, how to test proof with a spoon and a flame, how to spot a stranger pretending not to be watching. And they learn something even more important. Resistance is normal. Some call it stubbornness. You call it memory. It becomes part of your identity. While the rest of the country gets swept up in cities, factories, railroads, and progress, you keep your fire low and you're still hot. You don't want factories. You want a world where your hands still matter, where your worth isn't measured in banknotes but in how many winters you've survived, how many debts you've repaid, how many family members you've fed. And then, because history has a twisted sense of humour, Prohibition rolls in a century later like a tidal wave, and suddenly the whole nation joins you in illegal drinking. What they called crime, you called Tuesday. Now everyone's sneaking liquor under coats, hiding it in car trunks and acting like they invented rebellion. But you were here first. You kept the flame burning when no one else dared. The country went dry and you didn't even notice. Scholars argue about the true scope of the Whiskey Rebellion. Was it really a widespread uprising, or just a few rowdy pockets of resistance? But they miss the point. The point isn't whether you overthrew a government. The point is that you said no, loud enough and often enough that the government had to think twice. And that's the story of your people, really. Not conquest, not victory, but defiance. Long, slow, quiet defiance. You never asked for power. You just asked to be left alone. But when they came for your livelihood, you reminded them that being left alone isn't the same as being weak. You're not weak. You're a stone in the stream refusing to be moved. You're a fire in a hollow log burning long after the surface goes dark. And as long as the still runs, the mountains hum with your answer. No, not here. Your voice starts to sound different. Somewhere between the wagon road and the whiskey still, between the cornrows and the camp meetings, your accent begins to warp. Not by force, not on purpose. It just happens. It stretches and bends, borrowing syllables from the land itself. The way you speak isn't like the folks in Boston, or even the people a few counties east. It's something else now. You don't hear it at first. To you, it sounds normal. But when strangers visit, and they do sometimes, they tilt their heads when you talk, like they're tuning in a foreign station. You say yonder instead of over there. You don't say you all, you say y'all. And then, eventually, even that starts to slide into just ye, or youans, depending on which mountain hollow your people come from. Words clip shorter, vowels go longer, and whole phrases show up out of nowhere. Might could, fixing to, ain't never. grammar rules bend and snap like frostbitten twigs, and you don't lose sleep over it. You're not speaking for their approval, you're speaking for efficiency. And yet, there's beauty in it. The way you turn a phrase is less about correctness and more about flavour. Your metaphors come from the land, from livestock, from moon phases and mountain lore. Someone who talks too much is windier than a sack of busted whistles. A liar would climb a tree to tell a fib when he could stand on the ground and tell the truth. You don't just say it's raining, you say it's coming down like a cow peeing on a flat rock. Colourful? Yes. Understandable? Only if you live here. This isn't just slang, it's a dialect. A full-blown Appalachian English formed in isolation, fermented in oral tradition, and flavoured by centuries of Scots-Irish rhythm. Linguists still scratch their heads over it. They hear echoes of Elizabethan English tucked into your sentences, like time forgot to sweep through these hills. Some scholars argue that your dialect preserves older forms of English lost elsewhere. Others think it's something entirely new, a stew of Border Scots, Ulster brogue, and pure Appalachian invention. Either way, it confuses outsiders, and you wouldn't have it any other way. It's not just the sound of your speech either, it's the stories you tell with it. You talk in circles sometimes, the way your grandfather did. You don't just say what happened, you build up to it, meandering through side characters and weather conditions, until finally you drop the punchline or the lesson like a boulder in a creek, and people listen, not because they're impatient for the end, but because the winding road is the point. You don't tell stories to get somewhere, you tell them to remember where you've been. Your folklore is thick and strange. There are ghosts, of course, always ghosts. Women in white who wander near creeks, lights that flicker on ridge tops and then vanish when you chase them. You've got haints, boogers, and witches who can stop a man's heart with nothing but a stare. You don't believe in all of it, but you also don't not believe. You hang horseshoes above doors, you don't whistle at night, you leave a biscuit out for something that might be watching, just in case. Then there are the codes, ways of speaking that outsiders will never break. You say, he's not right, and people know what that means. You say, she's touched, and no one needs details. When someone's gone wrong in the head, you don't use clinical terms, you use kindness, or at least Appalachian kindness, which often comes laced with blunt truth. You don't say someone died, you say they passed. You don't say someone's pregnant, you say she's expecting, or in a family way, or if you're really feeling poetic, caught herself. It's a world built on shared context. You don't need to explain everything, because the people you're talking to already know. They've lived the same weather, fought the same land, buried the same kind of dreams. So when you say, the Lord willing and the creek don't rise, they don't ask which creek or why. They just nod, because that's how you say, I'll try, but who knows what tomorrow brings. But that code works both ways. It keeps you close, and it keeps outsiders out. They come up here with clipboards and questions, and they leave with half answers and headaches. They try to record your speech, break it into syllables and rules. But what they don't get is that it's not just language, it's survival. It's how you tell who belongs and who doesn't, who understands silence, who can hear everything that's not being said. Because here, silence is sacred. You don't fill the air just to fill it. When a man sits on the porch for 2 hours and only says 3 words, that's not awkward. It's normal, comfortable even. It means there's no pressure to perform. You talk when you have something to say, and when you don't, you let the wind do the speaking, or the creek, or the crickets. You learn to listen, not just to words, but to tone, to rhythm, to the space between things. And sure, you've got a temper, everyone knows that, but you also have humour, dry as cornbread and sharp as a whip. You laugh at yourself, at each other, at the absurdity of trying to grow anything but rocks on this soil. You tell jokes that stretch on for 10 minutes and end with a groan and a slap to the knee. You chuckle when the preacher slips on the church steps and then help him up before he starts swearing. You grin when your child tries to outtalk you and ends up chasing their own tail mid-sentence. This language, this way of speaking, of thinking, of being, is your inheritance. You didn't get castles or estates. You got stories and sayings, voices echoing from across the Atlantic and down through the hollers. Every time you open your mouth, you carry them. Every time you say reckon or ain't, you lay another brick in a cultural wall that keeps you grounded, keeps you real. And when the rest of the world mocks your accent, tells you to talk proper, you just nod, smile and think, bless their hearts. Because you understand something they don't. You don't speak this way because you don't know better. You speak this way because you do. Revival doesn't come in softly. It doesn't knock. It doesn't wait for you to be ready. Revival shows up loud, sweaty, and barefoot, hollering scripture in the woods and rattling your bones whether you asked for it or not. You might have been raised Presbyterian, back when the sermons were tight, the songs were slow and nobody clapped. But that formality doesn't hold in the mountains, not for long. The Holy Spirit doesn't wear a collar out here. It comes howling through the trees with wild eyes and cracked voices and a rhythm that feels more like thunder than theology. It starts small, like most wildfires. A preacher shows up with a horse and a calling, builds a crude pulpit from split logs, and starts shouting about damnation to anyone who'll listen. The message isn't new, repent or burn, but the delivery? That's something else entirely. He doesn't read from a manuscript. He paces, he stomps, he sweats like he's trying to wring sin out of his skin. He yells until his voice breaks, then keeps going. And somehow, it works. People start to come, from neighbouring hollers, from beyond the ridge, from wherever they've heard that something's stirring. Families pack wagons with blankets and biscuits and make the trek for what they call a camp meeting, but it's more like a week-long emotional landslide. You pitch tents in the clearing, cook over open fires, and gather in the evenings when the air is cool and the mood turns electric. There's no building, no bell, no pews, just a crowd of sinners and seekers sitting on stumps and logs, staring down the barrel of judgment. And once it starts, it doesn't let up. The preaching comes in waves, hour after hour, preacher after preacher. Some tall and stern, some short and shaking, all of them fired up like they swallowed lightning. They quote scripture in bursts, voice cracking on the edge of tears or fury. People start weeping, falling to their knees. Some shout, some shake, some just sit there, quiet, staring at the ground like the earth itself opened up and whispered their worst secret. It's not dignified, it's not neat, but it's real. You don't know what to make of it at first. You were taught to worship with restraint, no shouting, no clapping, just orderly singing and sermons with clear three-point outlines. But now you're seeing something different. Something messy, yes, but powerful. The kind of power that doesn't wait for Sunday morning. The kind that grabs your shirt collar and says you've got to change or you're going to break. The kind that makes grown men cry in front of their neighbours and women lift their hands without caring who's watching. This kind of religion takes root in the soil of suffering. People come to these revivals broken, by hunger, by loss, by guilt they don't know how to name. They come because something in them still hopes for mercy, even if they've never felt worthy of it. And in the flickering firelight of a mountain clearing, surrounded by people just as worn down, they start to believe it's possible. That forgiveness isn't something reserved for fancy churches and polished shoes. That maybe, just maybe, God sees them too. And the music, it's a sermon of its own. The hymns aren't polished. They rise from the crowd like smoke, imperfect, aching, and full of life. Some are shape note songs with names like Idumea and Wondrous Love, songs that sound like they came from another planet or at least another century. Others are just call and response ballads, easy to remember, easier to feel. "Shall we gather at the river?" someone sings, and the rest answer before they've even thought about it. These songs wrap around you, stitching the crowd into something bigger than itself. You sing not because you know all the words, but because the words know you. They find the sore spots, the silent fears, the buried things you swore you'd never bring up again, and you sing through tears, through doubt, through that strange glowing warmth in your chest that makes you want to fall to your knees or shout hallelujah just to let some of the pressure out. There's no dress code here, no social ladder, no fancy hats or polished shoes, just bare feet, rolled up sleeves, sunburned cheeks, and hearts wide open. You might find the richest man in the county sobbing beside a farmer who hasn't had a full meal in weeks. The Holy Spirit doesn't care about titles. It levels everyone, strips them down to their need, and offers something heavier than comfort, conviction. And it spreads. From one meeting to another, from one hollow to the next. Preachers become circuit riders, galloping from camp to camp, barely stopping to rest, carrying worn Bibles and burning hearts. Some are barely literate, but they can quote the Gospels from memory and spin a parable that'll stick in your head for months. Others are educated, sure, but out here, the measure of a preacher isn't his schooling. It's how many people fall to their knees when he says, "Come forward." This isn't a religious movement in the way people talk about them in history books. It's not centralized. There are no headquarters, no denominational power brokers, It's just wildfire faith, burning wherever there's enough dry wood and broken hearts to catch. Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, even a few old-time Quakers and renegade Anglicans, labels start to blur. What matters is the fire. What matters is the change. Of course, not everyone approves. Some of the old-timers shake their heads. They miss the dignity, the doctrine, the quiet strength of a sober sermon. Others fear the emotionalism, say it's more hysteria than holiness. And maybe there's truth to that. Maybe not everyone who collapses in the sawdust goes home a changed man, but plenty do. And you can't deny what you've seen with your own eyes. Drunks who gave up the bottle. Thieves who returned stolen goods. Families who started praying together because they saw what life looked like without it. Scholars will later call it the Second Great Awakening. They'll try to draw lines around it, assign dates and figures and causes, but to you, it was simpler. It was a moment when heaven bent down close to the mountains and whispered, "Even here." And in that whisper, you found a kind of hope you didn't think belonged to people like you. Not city folks, not preachers' sons, but you. Just a sinner from a crooked ridge, singing in the dark. You don't call it a temper. To you, it's just the way things are handled. If a man crosses a line, you draw one deeper. If someone wrongs your family, you don't take it to a courthouse. You take it to their front porch. And if he won't come out, well, there's always next time. It's not about violence, not really. It's about a code. One older than these ridges. One carried over from clan fights and cattle raids in Scotland. Hardened in the fields of Ulster. And sharpened even more on this side of the Atlantic, where the law is either too far away or too late. And sure, maybe it is a temper, but it's a practical one. A survival instinct. You didn't make it this far by letting things slide. You speak plain, hit hard, and remember who owes who. That memory of yours, longer than a snake's shadow in August, that's what keeps your people alive. Because out here, reputation is currency. If folks think you'll tolerate being pushed around, they'll do it again. And if they think you've got a spine made of hickory and hands that know how to grip a rifle stock, they'll think twice. It starts early. You see it in your grandfather, who tells stories with his jaw clenched like the past is something he's still chewing. You hear it in your mother, who doesn't flinch when a rooster pecks her shin, just grabs it by the neck, whispers something that sounds suspiciously like a prayer and a threat, then goes back to hanging laundry. You learn that nothing comes easy, that people will take advantage if you let them, and that a slow burn lasts longer than a loud flame. Feuds aren't just myths in this part of the mountains, they're family history. You can walk past a field and hear, "That's where Jesse Taylor and that McNeely boy squared off in '89. You don't ask which 89, they all know which one. Some fights last for generations, passed down like heirlooms, names whispered at the supper table with a scowl. You don't even remember what started it. Something about a fence, a pig, a wedding gone wrong. Doesn't matter now. What matters is that your name was spoken in anger, and that sticks harder than pine sap. You're taught to handle it quiet if possible. Public feuding's a last resort. Better to send a message with silence, with a cold shoulder at church, with a mysteriously downed tree blocking someone's trail. You learn how to send a warning without saying a word. A rooster left on a doorstep, a carving in a fence post. Even the way you stand, arms crossed, eyes level, jaw set, can say more than a sermon. But when it does go loud, it goes real loud. Gunfire echoes through hollers like thunder with bad manners, and suddenly, folks are choosing sides. Not because they want to, but because blood runs thicker than reason, and sometimes choosing not to take a side is more dangerous than the feud itself. Everyone knows the rules. Keep your mouth shut, keep your kids close, and don't be caught in the wrong place when tempers boil. Still, even in the middle of a long-running feud, you know how to draw a line. There are things you don't do. You don't harm women or children. You don't burn a man's house unless he's in it and asking for it. You don't drag it into the church or the cemetery. Those places are off limits, neutral ground. Even a blood feud has boundaries. You may have a temper, but you're not a monster. That's the part outsiders don't get. They hear about Appalachian feuds and picture wild-eyed hill folk shooting from behind moonshine barrels, just for the thrill. But that's not it. It's not about thrill. It's about pride, about justice, about being wronged so many times that eventually you decide to handle things your own way. Because nobody else will. Because the law doesn't come up your road unless someone's already dead. And sometimes, not even then. Some of the most famous feuds in history, the Hatfields and McCoys for example, aren't just stories to you. They're blueprints, warnings, evidence that when the anger goes unchecked, it consumes everything. Land, family, reputation. You know that danger well. You've seen it. A cousin buried before his time, a neighbour who disappeared after taking the wrong side, and you ask yourself, is it worth it? Sometimes the answer is no, so you let it go, slowly, quietly. You shake a hand after years of not speaking. You wave from the road one morning instead of pretending not to see each other. It doesn't mean you've forgotten. It just means you're tired. Of blood, of grudges, of the weight of generations grinding down your shoulders. Even the proudest folks get tired. Still, the temper is always there, underneath, like a coal bed that never quite goes cold. It's why you're quick to defend someone who can't defend themselves. Why you step in when the law looks the other way. Why you're ready to square up if someone talks sideways about your sister, or your kin, or the way your people live. You know violence isn't noble, but sometimes it's necessary. And when it is, you don't hesitate. People often mistake that readiness for savagery. They write you off as backward, barbaric. But they miss the code behind the temper, the honour, the loyalty, the unwritten rules that hold your community together when everything else falls apart. You might raise your voice, but you also raise barns. You might clench your fists, but you also open your door to neighbours in need. The temper is just one tool in your belt, used sparingly but effectively. And if someone calls you hot-headed, you don't argue. You just smile. Because if they think that's all you are, they don't know you at all. Family matters more than anything else out here. It's not a saying, it's a law. Older than any court, stronger than any sheriff, and more binding than any preacher's vows. In these mountains, when things fall apart, and they will, it's your kin who patch you up, feed you, or bury you, depending on the outcome. So you keep them close. Sometimes a little too close. And if that means marrying your second cousin because the nearest non-relative lives 2 ridges over and your mule's too stubborn to make the trip, well, so be it. You don't exactly advertise that part, of course, but it's not the scandal outsiders make it out to be. In a world where travel is hard, strangers are rare, and community grows slow like moss on stone, options are limited. It's not about keeping bloodlines pure or any highborn nonsense. It's about proximity. If you share a family name with half the county, someone's bound to end up marrying a cousin. That's not depravity. That's math. Besides, it's not always blood that makes a person kin. It's loyalty, shared sweat, shared grief. That neighbour who helped you dig out after the flood, who held your hand when the fever took your boy, he's kin now, whether the tree agrees or not. And the cousin who moved to town and won't write back. You don't say it out loud, but he's a stranger these days. You marry young, not because you're rushing, but because life out here doesn't wait. You fall in love over shared chores and long walks to revival meetings. Courtship isn't flowers and poetry, it's hauling firewood, fixing fence posts, sitting on porches with quiet laughter and louder mosquitoes. You don't propose with diamonds, you propose with a promise that you'll build her a home, raise her children, and fight for her if you have to. And once you're married, it's all in. No half measures. You live together, work together, eat together, and if need be, hide the whiskey still together. She knows your moods before you do. You can read her silence better than a book. Marriage isn't some romantic fantasy. It's a survival pact, built on equal parts affection, endurance, and a mutual agreement to ignore each other's more annoying relatives. Your household fills up fast. Children come like seasons, regular, unpredictable, and sometimes unwelcome in their timing. You love them fiercely, though you don't always say it out loud. That's not your way. Your love comes in actions, splitting wood so they stay warm, showing them how to trap rabbits, letting them sip watered-down whiskey when they're sick. When you tell your son he did a good job, that's currency. When you tell your daughter she's strong, that's armour. You raise them to be useful, not just because you need the help, but because you know the world won't be kind to them. You teach them how to plant, how to shoot, how to lie convincingly when a taxman comes asking questions. You teach them how to hold their ground and when to walk away. You don't shelter them from the hard things. You prepare them for them. And family keeps growing. Cousins, aunts, uncles. Your house may be small, but your table stretches as far as it needs to. Sunday dinners spill out onto porches, into yards, with babies on laps and cornbread in every hand. It's chaotic, noisy, and absolutely perfect. These aren't just meals, they're tribal gatherings. You pass the potatoes and gossip with equal ease. You settle grudges between bites. You hear stories from before your time, passed down like relics, shaped and reshaped with every retelling. Births and deaths are community events. When a baby comes, everyone shows up with stew, blankets, unsolicited advice, and a few jokes about how tired you look. And when someone dies, the whole ridge feels it. You don't wait for a funeral home. You lay them out in the parlour, keep vigil, sing all night. The old songs, the ones about crossing rivers and resting under trees. There's crying, of course, but also laughter. Because remembering someone fully means remembering the time they fell off the mule cart and landed in the preacher's chicken coop. You bury your dead on the hill, under stones you carved yourself, or maybe just a wooden cross if the winter comes too soon. You visit those graves, not because you believe the dead need company, but because you do. You sit, talk, maybe leave a little whiskey if the spirit moves you. It's not about ghosts. It's about keeping the thread alive from the past to the present. You are who you are because of them. That's the thing about these family trees. They don't grow tall and proud. They grow wide and tangled, hugging the ground, sinking roots deep into rock and red clay. You know everyone's business, and they know yours. There's no privacy, not really. But there's comfort in that too. If you stumble, a dozen hands are already reaching to catch you, or at least to drag you back onto your feet with a sarcastic comment and a loaf of cornbread. Of course, it's not all harmony. Families this close don't just love hard. They fight hard. A single argument can last generations. You'll hear, "She hasn't spoken to her sister since 46, and no one even remembers what happened. Just that it involved a pie, a borrowed quilt, or a man with more charm than sense. And nobody brings it up at dinner unless they want to eat in silence. But deep down, it's understood. When push comes to shove, family circles the wagons. You might call your brother a fool every day of the week, but if someone else does, you're suddenly standing real close with your fists clenched and a grin that says, "Try me." Scholars have poked and prodded at Appalachian family structure, wondering how these kinship networks functioned without much government help. But the truth is, you didn't need outside help. You built a support system out of necessity and trust. You knew how to stretch a dollar, how to care for the sick when doctors were 2 days away, how to raise each other's children when needed. You didn't have a social safety net. You were the net. And that's the quiet strength nobody sees from the outside. They call it backwards, insular, inbred even. But they don't see the resilience, the woven web of lives supporting one another through flood, fire, famine, and the slow grind of time. You didn't just survive out here. You built a dynasty. Not one of castles or titles, but of cabins and kin, and the kind of love that doesn't need saying to be known. Because in these mountains, home isn't a place. It's a who. You don't have a radio. Not yet. Electricity hasn't made it up your ridge, and even if it had, nobody's sending you bills you can't pay for something you can do without. But you do have a fiddle, and a banjo, and maybe a dulcimer, if your uncle with the calloused fingers and whittling habit passed one down. And that's enough. More than enough. Because out here, music isn't a hobby, it's breath. It's what fills the silence between chores, between heartbreaks, between lives. You don't remember the first time you heard it. It was always there, like rain on the roof or wind through pine needles. It comes from everywhere and nowhere. Songs your mother hummed while canning peaches. Tunes your grandfather played after supper when his feet hurt too much to do anything else. Rhythms that echo in your bones when the day's done and the porch is the only place left to be. The fiddle doesn't speak English, but it knows what you mean. It can cry when words won't come. It can laugh better than most folks you know. And when someone pulls that bow across the strings just right, the whole world leans in to listen. That music you make isn't polished. It doesn't need to be. It's crooked like the mountains, raw like fresh chopped wood, and proud like a mule that won't move until it's good and ready. You don't write it down. You live it down. Past hand to hand, knee to knee, and smoky kitchens and fieldside shade. You pick it up by watching, trying, failing, then playing it until your fingers bleed or your soul quiets, whichever comes first. Some of the tunes are old, really old, ballads from across the ocean carried in memory and mouth, passed down through the centuries like family heirlooms. They tell stories of betrayal, of forbidden love, of battles fought with swords instead of words. You don't always understand every line, but you feel them. The shape of them, the ache. A song like Barbara Allen doesn't need translating. Heartbreak sounds the same in every accent. And then there are the reels and jigs, tunes that don't bother with lyrics because they're too busy moving. You tap your feet before you even realise it. Before long, your daughter's up and spinning barefoot in the yard, and someone's keeping time on the porch rail like it's a drum sent by God. These songs don't ask for permission. They demand joy, even when there's not much of it to go around. Now add a banjo. Not that slick 5-string bluegrass banjo you hear on the radio decades later, but an older thing. A rougher, deeper sound that plucks its way out of the dusk like it was born from the hills themselves. Some folks forget that the banjo came from Africa, carried by enslaved hands, shaped in silence and survival. But not you. You feel the ghost of it in every note. Appalachian music isn't just Scots-Irish. It's a stew. A wild, bubbling pot of every culture that climbed these mountains and left something behind. Black, white, indigenous. It all mixes. It has to. Because hardship doesn't discriminate, and neither does rhythm. The dulcimer's a quieter thing. It doesn't holler like a fiddle or thump like a banjo. It hums, like a lullaby wrapped in wool. You play it for babies, for funerals, for long evenings when the world feels too sharp. It's not a flashy instrument, and that's exactly why you love it. It's mountain modest. Like most of your people, it does its job without asking for applause. What you're doing, without knowing it, is laying the foundation for a whole musical tradition. A thing the world will one day call Appalachian folk, then old time, then bluegrass, then country. But you're not chasing a genre. You're chasing truth. You're telling your story in the only language that doesn't lie. No orchestras, no sheet music, just grit and heart and strings. The best music you'll ever hear doesn't happen on a stage. It happens at dusk, on a porch, when someone picks up a fiddle without saying a word and just starts. Maybe a cousin joins on banjo. Maybe someone pulls a jaw harp out of their pocket like a magic trick. Before you know it, you've got 4 generations sitting around sharing the only inheritance that matters, songs that make the hard days bearable, and the good days last a little longer. And those songs evolve. You add verses, steal lines from other families, change the ending because it suits you better. No one minds. That's the rule. The song is alive, and living things change. You might put a gospel spin on an old murder ballad, or turn a fiddle tune into a hymn if the mood feels holy. What matters isn't accuracy. What matters is feeling. If it makes your foot tap or your chest tighten, you keep it. If not, you throw it out with the dishwater. Some songs are silly, about drunken frogs, lazy husbands, or chickens with suspicious habits. Others go so deep you can't even sing the chorus without something catching in your throat. And then there are the songs you don't sing around strangers. The ones about hard times, hunger, grief, and things that happened on cold nights when the lantern went out and nobody could speak of it afterward. Those songs are private, sacred. Maybe you only hum them under your breath while chopping wood. Maybe you don't even realise you're humming until someone looks at you funny and you stop. The world doesn't understand this music. Not yet. It hears twang and thinks backward. It hears banjo and thinks punchline. But the world doesn't know what you know. That this music holds everything. Memory, history, defiance, joy, grief. It holds your people's entire journey, from Scotland's winds to Ulster's fields to these Appalachian ridges where the echoes still haven't died out. And one day, long after you're gone, someone will wander into these hills with a tape recorder and wide eyes. They'll ask for your songs, and if you're feeling generous, you might give them a few, but not all, never all, because the best ones, the real ones, aren't meant to be recorded. They're meant to be remembered. When war comes, it doesn't ask which side of the mountain you live on. It just rolls in like a storm, messy and unpredictable, and you're forced to pick a side, or pretend to, long enough to survive it. By the time the Civil War reaches your ridge, it's not blue versus grey so much as neighbour versus neighbour, brother against brother, and kin against kin in a place already wired for tension. You didn't ask for this war. You've already fought too many, against landlords, tax collectors, starvation and time itself. But now the country wants to divide, and you're stuck in the cracks. The lowland plantations are shouting secession and waving Confederate flags like they were born with them in hand. But up here in the mountains, it's not that simple. You don't own slaves. Most folks in your holler haven't even seen one. The idea of fighting to protect an economy built on something so distant and cruel doesn't sit right. You're poor, independent, stubborn, and when someone tells you what side you should be on, You tend to do the opposite just out of principle. But you're not exactly waving the Union flag either. The federal government has never done much for you except send taxmen and occasionally blame you for being ungovernable. You've lived on your own terms for generations. Now they both come knocking, asking for loyalty, for blood, for sons and brothers and husbands, to march off into a war that barely makes sense when your biggest concern yesterday was a busted plough and a pig that won't stay in the fence. So what do? Some of you sign up for the Union, mostly out of a belief in unity, or just to stop the big plantation owners from getting even more power. Others ride with the Confederacy, pulled by regional pride, neighbour pressure, or the promise of a few dollars to keep your farm afloat. And a lot of you, maybe more than either side wants to admit, try to hide. You slip into the trees, you play both sides when you have to, you lie through your teeth, you make promises to recruiters with your fingers crossed behind your back. Because when everyone's lying, sometimes survival means doing the same. The mountains become a no-man's land. Official armies march through from time to time, but the real danger isn't men in uniform. It's the irregulars, the bushwhackers, the home guards, groups of armed men riding with badges made of tin or none at all, enforcing whatever twisted version of the law suits them that week. They call themselves patriots, but most days they're just thieves with a cause and an itchy trigger finger. Your neighbour joins one of these groups, and you stop letting your children walk to the spring alone. Another neighbour disappears, and folks start whispering. No one trusts anyone completely. Churches go quiet. Even funerals feel tense. You never know who's watching, who's reporting, or who's waiting for a reason to turn you in for a sack of cornmeal and a clean shirt. Sometimes the violence is official. A Union detachment raids your homestead, looking for hidden rebels. They take your mule, your grain, your son if he looks old enough to carry a rifle. Then a week later, the Confederates come and accuse you of aiding the enemy. They take your other mule and burn your shed just for spite. You look at the ashes and wonder which side you're even supposed to hate more. And the worst part? The grief doesn't care what colour uniform your boy was wearing when he died. When the letter comes, or more likely when it doesn't, you stand on your porch, looking out over the ridge, and feel like the world cracked in half and swallowed the better part of you. Maybe he died at Antietam, or Chickamauga, or in a field no one can pronounce. Doesn't matter. He's gone. And the corn still needs planting. The women bear the worst of it. With the men off fighting or hiding, the work falls on them. They tend the crops, butcher the hogs, protect the children, and load the rifle when strangers come up the trail. They grieve in silence, cook without enough salt, and pray with a fury that shakes the cabin walls. They're not fragile, they're forged. Your music changes during the war. The songs get slower, sadder, full of unanswered prayers and names whispered into the dark. You stop singing about fiddle contests and start singing about dying boys and fields soaked in blood. Ballads emerge, long, mournful stories of lovers torn apart, of soldiers who never came home. These songs travel from one cabin to the next, shape-shifting along the way, collecting verses like scars. After the war, nothing feels the same. The mountain survived, but something inside you didn't. The neighbours you fought alongside or against still live nearby, and there are too many ghosts between you now to make easy peace. Some people pack up and leave, heading west, chasing a new start. Others stay, rebuilding from ashen memory, trying to pretend that what happened can be folded away like a flag. But the war doesn't leave. Not really. It settles in the soil, in the way people avoid eye contact at the general store, in the new names added to the old cemetery. It lingers in the cracks of your front door and the creak of the floorboards at night when you swear you can hear boots outside. You survive because that's what you do. But surviving ain't the same as forgetting. And years later, when some outsider rolls in asking about your Civil War loyalties, you just squint at them and say, well, that's a complicated thing. Because it is. Because you weren't fighting for slavery or even for Lincoln. You were fighting for the right to live, to keep what little you had, to protect your family from armies that all seem to wear the same hungry expression. Historians still don't quite know what to do with Appalachian war stories. They don't fit neatly into their maps and timelines. The loyalties are too tangled, the motives too messy. But that's the truth of it. In these hills, the Civil War wasn't about flags. It was about survival, suspicion, and a deep-rooted instinct to not be told what to do by people who don't know your name. You didn't fight for glory. You fought because someone came up your mountain and told you they owned it. Even after the war ends and the uniforms are folded away or buried with the bones of boys who never made it home, something keeps boiling in the back hollers and smoky ridges. The law has shifted again, and once more it wants something from you. Not your land this time, not your son, but your still. That's right, your whiskey's back on the chopping block. The government calls it illegal. You call it Tuesday. Prohibition doesn't start with the famous amendment. It starts here, in these hills, years before the rest of the country decides to sober up. Temperance leagues, most of them led by stern women with big hats and bigger opinions, start showing up in towns preaching the evils of drink. They say whiskey destroys families, weakens morals, ruins men, and maybe they're not entirely wrong. You've seen what happens when someone drinks too deep and too often. You've seen fists fly and plates shatter and tears fall, but they don't understand the why. They don't see the bigger picture. Out here, whiskey isn't just a vice, it's a lifeline. You can't haul your corn 100 miles over broken roads to sell it fresh. But you can distill it into something strong and shelf-stable, something portable, tradable, essential. It's medicine when nothing else works. It's payment when cash is scarce. It's the last sip of comfort at a funeral and the first toast at a wedding. It's culture in a jar. So when the laws get tighter and the whispers start, the revenuers are coming. You don't panic. You adapt. You move your still deeper into the woods. You dig it into the side of a hill, line the trail with twigs that snap just so when someone unfamiliar walks through. You keep the fire low, the operation silent, and if they do find it, well, it's not like you're going to just hand it over. Moonshining becomes more than a secret. It becomes a statement, a full-bodied, high-proof declaration that you will not be told what to do by people who don't know what it took to survive up here. You work too hard for your food, your family, your pride. You're not going to surrender your independence because some city councilman read a pamphlet. And oh, the revenuers. Those poor souls riding up from the lowlands in government-issued boots, thinking they can sneak around in country they've never studied. They don't know the trails. They don't know which dogs bite and which are trained to bark at strangers. They don't know that down by the creek actually means nowhere near the creek. You speak in riddles when they ask questions. You smile too politely. You offer them coffee laced with just enough insult to make them nervous. Sometimes it turns violent. You don't want it to, but it does. Shots fired in the dark. Barns set ablaze. Arrests that turn into feuds that stretch for years. A federal agent gets too bold, kicks in a cabin door, roughs up a granny, and suddenly everyone's armed and angry. Justice isn't found in a courtroom. It's found behind a pine tree, rifle in hand, heart thudding like a war drum. But more often you just outwit them. You're cleverer than you look. You dig false trails. You float your barrels down creeks at night. You train your children to carry messages without writing a word. You hide jars in places no one would think to look. In hollow logs, under outhouse floors, in the bellies of pigs you swear are just fat from acorns. Meanwhile, you keep the tradition alive. You teach your sons and nephews how to read the bubbles, how to cut the heads and tails from a run, how to smell for sweetness or danger. The process becomes sacred. Each still has its own character, its own quirks. Some shine runs hot and fiery, others smooth like mountain honey. It depends on the corn, the yeast, the season, the cook. No two batches are the same, and everyone swears their recipe's the best. And let's be honest, some of you women are better at it than the men. Granny may look harmless in her apron and shawl, but she knows more about fermentation than half the state legislators. She keeps the ledger in her head, the customers in her prayers, and the shotgun under the stairs. Nobody crosses her, not even the men who think they're in charge. If the men are the muscle of the moonshine world, the women are the brains, and often the better business operators. When national prohibition hits in the 1920s, you're already 10 steps ahead. While city slickers are mourning the loss of their speakeasies and champagne brunches, you're still sipping on clear liquor from a mason jar in your root cellar. In fact, demand increases. Suddenly your product is worth more than gold. Smugglers come from the cities, looking to buy barrels and pay in cash. You make more money in one season than your father made in 10 years, but with money comes risk. The stakes get higher. Rival crews form. Sabotage becomes a real threat. People poison each other's mash. False tips are given to the law to knock out the competition. And now the feds are coming in harder, faster, better funded. Airplanes scout for smoke trails. Cars with bigger engines chase you through winding roads. That's when another bit of mountain genius kicks in. The birth of the moonshine runner. You modify cars, strip them down, soup them up. Hidden compartments, bigger engines, better shocks. You drive fast and furious before it was a movie, racing through hairpin curves like the devil's chasing you. Some say this is where stock car racing starts, and they're not wrong. Those old moonshine runners become the first race car drivers, men with nerves of steel and a trunk full of felony. And yet, through it all, you keep going. Because this isn't just about whiskey. It never was. It's about independence, control. A way of life that says, we don't need your permission to exist. And when they finally repeal prohibition, when the country comes crawling back with its hangover and its regrets, you're still standing, still brewing, still whispering recipes down the generations. Today folks drink craft spirits and pay $40 for a bottle of legal moonshine in a tourist town. But the real thing? It never needed labels. It came from sweat and risk and knowing the difference between good liquor and something that'll blind you. It came from the hills, and it still does. There's always someone coming in with a clipboard and a plan. Some man in a coat too clean for real work, talking fast about progress and opportunity, like you haven't been surviving just fine without either. He walks your ridge with shiny shoes and soft hands, pointing at the ground like it's a blank slate. But to you, this isn't blank. It's family. It's memory. It's buried ancestors and sweat-soaked roots, and a hard-won kind of peace that only comes from making your own way. And yet he sees none of that. What he sees is coal. Turns out, what's beneath your feet is worth something. More than something. It's everything to the outside world. Black gold, they call it, though it don't shine and it don't glisten. Still, it fuels their cities, their factories, their bright electric lights. And now they want yours. They don't say it like that, of course. They say investment. They say jobs. They say modernization. But what they mean is, we're taking your mountain. It begins slow. A few men show up offering cash for mineral rights. They act friendly, call you sir, tip their hats to your wife. The contracts are long and full of words you've never seen before, but they promise you won't even notice the mining. Just a little digging, they say. Won't bother the surface. You'll still have your land. And the money? Well, it sounds good. Too good. You've got a leaking roof, a busted plough, and 4 kids who've outgrown their shoes. So you sign. Later you'll find out mineral rights means they own what's under your land. And sometimes, if they want to get to it bad enough, they'll find a way to take what's on top too. That's how it starts. Then the machines come. Loud, strange beasts with metal jaws and endless hunger. They tear into the hills like they're peeling an orange, scraping away topsoil, trees, creeks, anything in their way. They call it strip mining. You call it a desecration, a violation. The mountain you were raised on starts disappearing, hauled away truckload by truckload. The air turns strange. Dust hangs heavy, tastes bitter on the tongue. The water runs darker. You can't always see the coal, but you can feel it, settling into your lungs, your wells, your children's coughs. And the company men? They're nowhere to be found now. They've moved on to the next ridge, the next contract. You're left with a cheque that's already gone and a view that looks like something died. Of course, they don't all strip mine. Some go deep, tunnelling into the earth like moles with dynamite. The company builds towns around the shafts, tight little rows of houses all painted the same, with general stores that charge whatever they please and pay you in company scrip instead of cash. You work 12 hours a day for wages that barely feed your family, then spend it all at the store owned by the same men who sign your paycheck. It's a loop, and you're caught in it. The work is brutal. It chews you up. The dust alone will ruin your lungs by 40. The accidents, cave-ins, gas leaks, explosions take more than a few good men every year, and the company always has a line of replacements waiting. Desperate boys with calloused hands and no better options. You bury your friends in shallow graves and go back down the shaft the next morning, because that's just how it is. Some folks take pride in the work. You can't blame them. There's something honest in earning your keep with your body, but you can't help but notice who gets rich and who gets buried. The owners live far away, in cities with clean air and manicured lawns. They never set foot in the mines, never visit the widow trying to raise 5 children on a pension that wouldn't feed a dog. They get the profit. You get the black lung, so you start to fight back. Quietly at first. You talk to your neighbours, you grumble about the store prices, the unsafe shafts, the script that isn't worth the paper it's printed on. Then someone uses a dangerous word, union. That's when things really heat up. Organising means risk. The company doesn't like it. The sheriffs don't like it. The men in Washington who profit from cheap coal definitely don't like it. If you even whisper about forming a union, you might find yourself fired, evicted, or worse. But you do it anyway. Because sometimes a man's got nothing left to lose but his chains, and the fights get real violent, strikes turn into shootouts. The company hires private detectives, Pinkertons and Baldwin Felts agents who treat you like enemy combatants instead of workers asking for dignity. They raid your homes, beat your leaders, throw your families out into the cold. At Blair Mountain in West Virginia, the fight gets so big they call in the US Army. Planes drop bombs on American soil, on your soil, just to stop miners from organising. They call it a rebellion. You call it Tuesday. Women join the fight. They march, protest, even take up arms. Mother Jones becomes a legend, travelling from camp to camp, stirring fire in the bellies of men who thought they were too tired to keep fighting. She calls out company men by name. She isn't afraid. And neither are you. Not anymore. Eventually you win something. Not everything. Not nearly enough, but something. Better wages, safer conditions, recognition, a seat at the table, even if it's the smallest chair in the corner. But you pay for it. In blood, in time, in sons who never made it home, in a landscape scarred beyond repair. Scholars will debate whether the coal companies built Appalachia or bled it dry. You already know the answer. They came in with promises, left with your mountains in their pockets, and blamed you when the land stopped producing. But you endured. You always do. You built lives on broken ground. You found joy in stolen moments and Sunday suppers and the music that kept rising even as the mountain fell. And long after the last shaft is sealed, long after the last strip mine is abandoned, the land remembers, the creeks try to heal, the trees come back, slow but stubborn, and in the silence your children learn what you always knew. You are more than what they came to take. The schools come late. They arrive after the mines, after the logging camps, after the church houses and courthouses, when someone finally decides that maybe children in the hills deserve to read something besides seed catalogues and tombstones. The buildings are simple, usually just one room with a bell on top and cracks between the floorboards, wide enough to lose a pencil in. A potbelly stove in the middle groans all winter long, and you can still see your breath during morning lessons. But it's something. It's a start. You walk miles to get there, through mud, snow, and poison ivy. No one drives you. You carry your books in a flour sack or under your arm, along with a biscuit or leftover cornbread wrapped in wax paper. Attendance depends on weather, chores, and whether your father needs help splitting wood that day. School isn't the priority, life is. But when you can make it, you go. Not for grades, not for futures, but for possibility. The teacher's barely older than the oldest students. Sometimes she's a local girl who learned just enough herself to teach others. Sometimes she's a stranger from the outside world, wide-eyed and underpaid, dropped off by the mission board or the state with a suitcase full of chalk and optimism. If she's smart, she learns fast to adjust her expectations, because here, kids don't sit still, don't know Latin, and don't care about grammar when their boots have holes and their bellies are growling. But they're smart, sharp as a fox with its tail in a trap. Give them a reason, and they'll latch onto learning like a dog on a bone. You might not speak proper, might not spell every word right, but you understand rhythm, story, numbers, weather, time. You know how to measure corn by the handful and track the seasons by smell. The teacher catches on, if she's worth her salt, start with what they know, then stretch it. A folk song becomes poetry, a moonshine recipe becomes chemistry, a family tree turns into a history lesson. Books are precious. They're passed down, patched up, shared like treasures. Dog-eared copies of McGuffey's Reader, tattered almanacs, old Bibles with brittle pages and names scribbled in the margins. You read slowly at first, stumbling over syllables like stones in a creek. But then one day, it clicks, and suddenly a new world opens up, one with more colours than even an autumn ridge. Not everyone learns to read. Some never get the chance. Others just don't see the point. If you're going to work in the mines like your daddy, why waste time with Shakespeare? But those who do learn never forget the way it changed them, not just because it brought the world closer, but because it proved something, that your mind is just as sharp as any city boy's. Sharper, maybe. Then come the missionaries. They don't just bring God, they bring systems, standardized education, formal curriculum, rules about who teaches what, how, and when. Some of it helps, some of it feels like a choke collar. You're taught that your dialect is incorrect, your customs are quaint, and your songs are just hillbilly nonsense. They say you need to be civilised, as if dignity wears a necktie and lives in a school district, but you know better. You know that just because your grammar is crooked doesn't mean your thoughts are. You can tell a better story than any textbook. You can recite family history going back 5 generations without blinking. So you take what's useful and leave the rest. That's always been your way. Still, the idea of education starts to catch hold. Enough that some parents begin choosing school over chores. Enough that a few bright-eyed kids make it all the way to high school, real high school, in a town with paved roads and indoor plumbing. They come back changed, wearing store-bought shoes and quoting presidents. Sometimes they're admired, sometimes they're envied, sometimes they don't come back at all. And then, a rare one, usually the preacher's daughter or a coal miner's bookish son, makes it all the way to college. That word sounds almost mythical in these hills, like something whispered in stories. College means more than learning. It means escape, freedom, maybe even prosperity. But it also means distance, and distance in a place built on closeness can be dangerous. Some who leave never feel right again. They're caught between two worlds, too polished for home, too homespun for the outside. They come back for funerals maybe, or holidays. They bring gifts, stories, nervous smiles. But you can see it in their eyes. They're drifting, unmoored. You wonder if knowledge came with a price too high. And yet, when your child looks at you and says, "I want to go to school in Lexington," or "I got a letter from Berea College," you nod. Even if your heart hurts, even if you know they may never live on this land again. Education brings new ideas, but it also brings new eyes. Suddenly your people are being written about, studied, filmed. Outsiders with cameras and notepads show up asking questions about your way of life. They treat your moonshine still like a zoo exhibit. They scribble down your sayings and film your ballads like you're the last of an endangered species. It's strange being studied like that. Flattering maybe, but also suspicious. You wonder if they're here to help, or just to gawk. They publish reports about your poverty, your illiteracy, your cultural stagnation. You read those words and laugh bitterly, because they never saw your grandfather build a cabin with no nails. They never heard your sister recite poetry while shelling beans. They never learned to read the land like you did. Still, education doesn't stop. You keep pushing for it, even when funding is thin and teachers are scarce. Even when the government only remembers your region exists during election years. You form parent committees. You build schools with your own hands. You pass down what you know even when no one else is looking. Because deep down you understand. Knowledge is power. And not the kind that lords over people, but the kind that lets you protect what's yours. The kind that helps you argue your land case in court. The kind that teaches your daughter to fix the truck and your son to write a letter so sharp it cuts through bureaucracy like a blade. You're not asking for pity. You're not even asking for help. You're just asking for a fair chance to learn, and maybe to teach the world a thing or two in return. There comes a time when the hills don't hold you anymore, not because they've turned against you, but because you've outgrown the small slice of land that's been passed down through too many hands. The soil's worn out, the coal's drying up, and the factory down the road laid off another round of workers last month. You wake up one morning with a strange feeling in your gut, the kind that says, maybe I need to go. Not for good, maybe, but long enough to send money back, long enough to build a future that doesn't start and end in the same square mile. So you pack what little you have, maybe just a duffel, maybe just courage, and you follow the trail that others from your ridge have already carved. Some head north to Pittsburgh, where the steel mills swallow up men by the hundreds. Others chase auto work in Detroit or factory jobs in Ohio, where the pay is steady and the winters are sharp enough to make you miss home by November. You don't know what you're getting into exactly, but you know what you're leaving behind. Leaving the mountains is a heartbreak all its own. You try not to look back when the bus rolls down the last familiar curve, but you do. Everybody does. The ridgeline looks softer from a distance, like it's already forgiving you for going. You swear you'll come back someday. Maybe for good, maybe just to bury your parents in the same plot where you'll end up one day too. Either way, a part of you never really leaves. The city hits you hard, not just the size of it, though that's dizzying enough. It's the noise, the stink, the speed of it all. People don't say hello when you pass them. They don't offer you coffee or ask after your mama. They talk fast, walk faster, and act like time is something they can never get enough of. You learn quickly that your drawl marks you. You say y'all once at a diner and the waitress smirks. You get asked if you're from the sticks. You are, of course, but it still stings. You learn to adjust. You shave a little off your accent, tighten up your speech. You keep some stories to yourself. You figure out how to navigate factory floors, union meetings, apartment leases, and city buses. You find other folks like you, men with the same calloused hands and faded work shirts, women who still say bless your heart even when it's clearly an insult. You build a little community, one front porch and potluck at a time, but there's loneliness in it. A quiet, aching kind. The kind that seeps in after your shift ends, when the machines are silent and you're sitting in a rented room with too much concrete outside the window. You miss the sound of frogs at night. You miss dirt roads and screen doors that slap shut behind you. You miss people who know you, who knew your parents, who remember the day your uncle wrecked his mule cart in the creek and blamed it on bad brakes. The jobs are better, sure. More money, more chances. You save up, send a little home each month. Maybe buy your mama a new stove or your brother a set of tyres. But there's a cost. You don't see your youngest grow up. You miss funerals. You hear about sickness and weddings in letters that take too long to arrive. Home becomes a story someone else tells you. For some, the city becomes permanent. They marry, raise children, find a church, settle into a rhythm. They still talk about the mountains like they're a dream they once had. Others can't hack it. They last a few months, maybe a year, then come back with empty pockets and heavy hearts. And then there are the in-betweeners, folks who leave but don't settle, who carry the mountains inside them like a ticking clock, always waiting for the right moment to return. The children of these migrants, well, they grow up different. They have the blood but not the dirt. They know how to say Appalachia, but they don't always know what it smells like after a summer rain. Their parents tell them stories, try to keep the old ways alive in city kitchens and Sunday schools, but it's not the same. Still, the stories stick. Sometimes all it takes is one summer visit to a cousin's farm or a funeral in a hollow church to ignite something, a spark of identity, a hunger for home. There's a whole generation raised this way, in between. Some become artists, writers, teachers, trying to translate Appalachian life for a world that's always misunderstood it. Some become activists, defending the old ways, fighting against stereotypes. Others just carry the legacy quietly, cooking cornbread in cast-iron pans and humming mountain ballads to their babies at night. And then, as the years go by, something shifts. The world outside the mountains starts to change. The economy buckles, the factories close, the promises of the cities break like old mason jars dropped on pavement. Suddenly, the life that once seemed backward and limited starts to look, well, resilient, sustainable even. People start talking about local food, self-sufficiency, community, things your people have been doing forever. Now some folks want to go back, not just to visit but to stay. Retired factory workers, grandchildren of miners, young couples who are tired of rent and traffic and screens. They buy land, fix up old cabins, learn how to can tomatoes and slaughter chickens. They call it homesteading like they invented it. You just smile, welcome them in, show them how to hold a hoe properly, let them figure out for themselves that chickens are meaner than they look. There's pride in this return, a sense that maybe, just maybe, the world is remembering the value of what Appalachia has always known, that the land can provide, that people matter, and that home is something you build, not something you buy. It's not a utopia. There's still poverty, still politics, still problems, but there's hope. You've come full circle in a way. The same hills that once pushed you out now call you back, and whether you return in body or just in spirit, whether your boots touch red clay or your kids just know the stories, you carry that thread, that lineage, that grit. You are, in the end, exactly what your ancestors were. Tough, tender, and always looking toward the ridge to see what's coming next. Because no matter how far you roam, you know the truth. You're not just from the mountains are from you. The world keeps trying to pin a label on you. Every few decades it comes back around, fresh-faced and full of certainty, waving some new term like a flag. Hillbilly, mountain folk, poor white trash, forgotten America. They say it like they're doing you a favour, like reducing generations of history, hardship and culture down to one tidy phrase helps anyone understand you better. But none of it sticks quite right. You're not a character in their stories. You're the whole story they don't have the guts to write. The term hillbilly is the one that lasts. It shows up in newspapers, then cartoons, then in black and white movies where men in floppy hats shoot at each other with flintlocks and argue over pigs. Then come the radio shows, the stage acts with fake beards and fake accents, where your world becomes a punchline. The world sees a jug with XXLX on it, a busted banjo and a barefoot child, and that's it. They think they know everything. You don't get a say in it. You're too far out, too quiet, too busy surviving to argue with Hollywood. So they make your image for you. Slack-jawed, slow-witted, dangerous or harmless depending on the scene. They don't know about the songs, the faith, the grit. They don't want to know. It's easier to mock a people than to ask why they were left behind. And the thing is, some of your own folks start believing it, internalising it, playing into it. If the world insists on calling you a hillbilly, you might as well lean into the stereotype, laugh along with it, make a little money off the caricature. That's how it spreads. Hillbilly as identity, as rebellion, as resignation. A kind of armour that looks like laughter but hides something bitter underneath. Then comes the television era, and with it shows like the Beverly Hillbillies. It's meant to be funny. Rural folk strike it rich and confuse elevators for magic boxes. America laughs. You watch too sometimes. It's entertaining, sure, but somewhere in your gut something stings. You recognise the accent. You recognise the names, the cabin, the values. It's you, turned inside out and shaken for jokes. And when the war on poverty rolls into town in the 1960s, they bring cameras. They want footage of barefoot children on porches, sagging cabins, toothless grins. They film without context, without compassion. They say they're trying to help, but what they really want is pity. They broadcast your life to the rest of the country like it's a cautionary tale. Look what happens when people fall behind. They don't show the gardens, the music, the strength of a grandmother raising 5 kids while sewing quilts and holding a church together. They don't film the joy, the intelligence, the resistance. Just the broken pieces, the worst angles. It becomes hard to look at yourself after that, like you've been tricked into shame. Still, you don't disappear. You never do. You start speaking up. Writers from the mountains begin publishing books that push back. Raw, true stories that tell it how it really is. Poets who grew up in trailers, journalists who split wood before class, professors with coal dust in their blood. They reclaim the term Appalachian, polish it, sharpen it, remind the world that this region isn't a backwater, it's a cradle of culture, of resistance, of a kind of wisdom you can't learn in college. You learn to hold 2 truths at once. Yes, there is poverty here. Yes, there is struggle. But that is not all there is, and you are not defined by your worst day. You're proud of your accent, your slang, your weird old ways that make people laugh uncomfortably because they sense something powerful behind them. Something unbroken. Art becomes your weapon. Music, as always, carries the load. Now it's not just banjos and ballads, it's protest songs, folk revival, even rock and roll with a mountain backbone. Pain becomes poetry, trauma becomes testimony, and the world starts to listen differently. Not because it finally respects you, but because you refuse to be quiet. Then, in election years, the spotlight swings back around. Pundits talk about you like you're some alien voting bloc. They roll out maps with names like Trump Country and act like they've discovered a lost tribe. They ask why Appalachians vote the way they do, talk the way they do, cling to things the rest of the country discarded. They never ask what they missed, what they took, or how they failed you. So you stop waiting for them to get it. You start creating your own spaces, community radio, independent documentaries, online publications run by people who still smell like wood smoke. You teach your kids to be proud, not pitiful. You name your businesses after ridges and hollers. You wear the word hillbilly like a badge, but on your terms now, not theirs, because you figured something out. When people don't understand you, they try to control you. But if you stay rooted, if you know who you are, they can't pull you up. They can't sell you a new identity. You've already got one. It's woven into your DNA, carved into the sides of your mountains, sung in 4-part harmony at dusk. The scholars keep debating Appalachian identity, whether it's fixed or flexible, cultural or economic, regional or political. You just shake your head. Let them argue. You know what it is. It's your grandmother's hands. It's your uncle's fiddle. It's the way you turn everything into a story, everything into a song. It's the space between grief and humour, between defiance and grace. You may live in a trailer, a cabin, a house with a sagging porch and a satellite dish taped to the side. But you're not backwards. You're not stuck in the past. You're carrying the past and the future too, like fire in your pocket. So let them keep guessing. Let them keep labelling. You've been misunderstood for centuries. And still, you're here. Tourists always come in the fall. That's when the leaves turn loud, like the hills are trying to outdo each other in one last shout before winter. Caravans of minivans and shiny SUVs wind up the roads that were never meant for curves taken fast, their passengers craning their necks at the trees and pointing at barns like they've never seen old wood before. They stop at overlooks, snap a few pictures, and say things like, "It's just so quaint," as if that's all this place ever was, a backdrop for their seasonal awe. You watch them from your porch, coffee in hand, pretending not to notice, but you always notice. Because they look at this land with the wonder of someone stepping into a storybook, while you know every page they skipped. The floods, the fires, the famines, the grit between the roots. They see peace, but you remember the price. Still, tourism becomes another way to survive. It starts small. Handmade signs for apple butter and jams, a few quilts hung on a fence, a teenager with a banjo playing for tips beside the general store. Then it grows. Cabins get rented out to strangers looking for authentic mountain experiences. Craft fairs pop up. Every third house becomes a country store selling things you used to give away at church socials. You don't mind, not really. You're glad to see people coming in instead of leaving. But it's strange watching your life get packaged like a souvenir. Your mother's soap recipe, your uncle's carved whistles, your cousin's molasses cookies, now wrapped in brown paper and sold under names like Appalachian Treasures or Mountain Magic. Folks don't ask where the recipe came from. They just want the taste of old-time living, minus the hardship. And then come the outsiders who don't want to visit. They want to stay. Retirees, artists, folks running from cities they swear have lost their soul. They buy land cheap, build cabins with wide decks and big windows, post about living simply, while their generator hums in the background. Some mean well. They try to join in. They come to potlucks and learn to can tomatoes and even pick up some of the dialect. Others come with opinions about how things should be, how the schools should change, how the roads should be paved and the roosters kept quiet. You've seen it before. Gentrification, they call it in the papers. In real time, it looks like a church turning into a yoga studio, a field turning into a retreat centre, a graveyard in the woods being treated like a meditation spot. You try to welcome, but you also hold tight to what's yours. There's a difference between sharing and selling out. What complicates it all is how hungry the region still is. Tourism brings money, sure, but it's uneven. The towns near the Blue Ridge Parkway boom, while hollers just a few ridges away still scrape by. Land gets bought out by developers. Jobs come, but they're seasonal, or pay just enough to keep folks broke in nicer clothes. Some places lose their soul chasing someone else's idea of charm. And then there's the strange flip of identity. The same accent that once marked you for ridicule becomes trendy when spoken by a barista in a handmade flannel. Your way of life, once mocked as backward, is now romanticised, rustic, authentic, farm to table. The same food your granny made because there wasn't anything else now shows up on city menus for $30 a plate, served with artisan vinegar and a smug smile. But it's not all bad. Some of the attention feels earned. Documentaries made by locals start winning awards. Artists from the region find platforms to tell their stories. Real ones. Not stereotypes, not pity reels. Just truth, rough-edged and rooted. The folk music you grew up with, sung in kitchens and passed down in breath, finds new life in indie albums and backyard festivals. And when it's done right, when it's done with respect, it feels less like stealing and more like a kind of revival. Young folks start coming back too. Not in droves, not yet, but enough. They bring with them tech skills, fresh eyes, new ideas, but they also carry old hearts. They don't want to turn their towns into cities. They want to make them whole. They build coffee shops with Appalachian poetry on the walls. They organise farmers' markets and teach traditional crafts. They don't ask their grandparents to modernise. They ask to learn. It's a strange blend of old and new now. You have Wi-Fi in a house with a coal stove. You get text messages while gathering eggs. You follow weather apps, but still trust the clouds. Your child Skypes with friends in 4 states, then goes outside to string beans on the porch just like you used to. There's tension, of course. There always is. Not everyone welcomes change. Some folks see outsiders as intruders, not neighbours. Some worry the culture will get watered down, turned into something pretty and pointless. And they're not wrong to worry. But the deeper truth? You've always changed, always adapted. Your people have been absorbing and repurposing and reimagining since the first step off the boat in Ulster. You just prefer to do it on your own terms. The biggest fight now isn't against tourism or outsiders, is against forgetting, against letting your story be told by someone who only visited for a weekend. That's why you keep teaching the songs, telling the stories, cooking the food slow. You let the tourists come and buy their jams, but you also tell your kids the real stories while stirring the pot. You write things down, you record, you archive, you name your daughters after grandmothers and your sons after ridgelines. And when someone asks where you're from, you still say the same thing, with pride in your chest and a smile that knows its own worth. I'm from here. Let them make of it what they will. Eventually someone will ask you what it means to be Appalachian. They'll ask it earnestly, maybe with a notebook in hand or a camera pointed in your face. They'll want a neat answer, something quotable, something they can fit between quotation marks and file under regional identity. And you'll look at them for a long moment, because how do you answer a question like that without lighting a fire you can't put out? You might start with what it's not. It's not poverty, not ignorance, not isolation. Those are just the shadows people see when they squint from a distance. You'll say being Appalachian isn't about being stuck in time, it's about remembering time, carrying it, holding the stories of people who kept going when there was no reason to, when the land itself felt like it might swallow them whole. It's in the way your grandfather said your name with his jaw tight and his eyes soft. It's the way your grandmother moved through a kitchen like a dance, every motion rooted in someone else's memory. It's in the old pictures with no names written on the back, but you know who they are anyway because they look like you. You'll say it's about land, but not just owning it, knowing it. You know which trees flower first and which slope holds snow longest. You know where the deer cross, where the blackberries grow wild, and which rock to sit on when you want the world to make sense again. The land doesn't just surround you, it recognizes you. It has heard your footsteps for generations. Being Appalachian is faith too, not always the church kind, though there's plenty of that, but a deeper kind, a faith that life will go on, that winter will break, that the seeds you plant in spring will rise through the mud, even if last year's didn't, that if you lose something, you'll find something else, that God may not come when you call, but he'll sit on the porch with you when you can't sleep. It's humour, dry and sharp, laughter like a knife slipping between ribs, aimed at the absurdity of surviving in a world that constantly tries to measure your worth in terms you didn't agree to. You learn early on how to joke about hunger, heartbreak and hardship, not to minimise them, but to keep them from owning you. You learn to tell stories that end with a laugh, even if they start with a funeral. It's contradiction. You can be fiercely independent and deeply communal at the same time. You can cuss the government while still flying a flag. You can hate your neighbour one week and fix his roof the next. You can want your kids to leave and also want them to stay forever. You're not simple. You never were. You'll want to explain that poor and Appalachian are not synonyms. Neither are conservative and ignorant. That being rural doesn't mean being small-minded, that some of the smartest people you've ever met never stepped inside a college classroom, but they could build a house from memory, recite 100 years of family history, and spot a lie before the last word left your mouth. Maybe you'll bring up the fact that your people have been used, by companies, by politicians, by storytellers in shiny boots who come to these hills to mine dignity, the same way coal companies mined the land. And yet, they stayed. They endured. They built lives with scarred hands and broken hearts, and a kind of quiet joy that most of the world will never understand. You'll say it's not about nostalgia either. You don't romanticize the past. You know what it cost. You know what the winters were like when the woodpile ran low, what it felt like to bury babies before they had teeth, how your people smiled without having anything to smile about. But you honour the past. That's different. That's essential. It's also not monolithic. You'll tell them there are as many ways to be Appalachian as there are ridges in these mountains. Black Appalachians, queer Appalachians, indigenous Appalachians, immigrant families who found sanctuary in these folds. The region contains multitudes, always has. Anyone who tells you otherwise doesn't know the terrain or the people. You'll say it's in the music, sure, in the fiddle tunes and gospel harmonies and the stories that live in minor keys, but it's also in the silence, in the long pause before someone speaks, in the hush that falls before a storm rolls over the ridge, or in the stillness of a kitchen where grief sits with folded hands. And you'll say it's in the food, but not just what's on the plate, it's in how it got there. Grown, canned, cooked, shared. The way you don't leave someone's house without eating something, even if it's just a slice of tomato and a piece of bread. The way recipes are passed down with no measurements. Just a string of memories and muscle memory. Finally, you'll admit it's something you can't fully explain. It's in your marrow, in your speech, in the way you sit with sorrow like it's an old friend and greet joy like it might not stay long. It's in how you love people, hard and often, and even when they haven't earned it. Because one day you'll need that same grace yourself. Being Appalachian isn't a costume. It isn't a brand. It's not something you perform or prove. It's just who you are, quietly, stubbornly, beautifully, and always. So now that the dust's settled and the fires burn low, you can sit back and breathe in what's left of the journey. It's been long, centuries long really. From windswept Scottish cliffs to the rocky soil of Ulster, from the crowded holds of immigrant ships to the tangled forests of colonial America, and finally into the dark, rich folds of the Appalachian Mountains. You've walked every mile of it tonight, barefoot, uphill, both ways, with a fiddle under one arm and a sack of cornmeal under the other, and after all that, you're still here, still building, still singing, still telling stories over cast iron and coffee. You've survived war, famine, fire, coal, concrete, and more than your fair share of pity and misjudgment. But your roots are deep. That's what matters most now. The ridges remember, the hollers carry your voice. And whether your name is stitched into the family Bible or scribbled in the back of a paperback, you've added your line to a story that's far from finished. So let the outsiders keep guessing. Let the old jokes echo a little before they die out completely. You know who you are. You know what it took. And that knowledge, that quiet, steady truth, it hums in your blood like a hymn with no words. Maybe you're still in the mountains. Maybe you're 1,000 miles away, dreaming of red clay and honeysuckle. Either way, you carry it. You carry them. You carry you. And that's the story now. Thanks for sticking with me. Close your eyes. Let the rhythm of the mountains lull you to sleep. You're home.